Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Story 1. My name is Marcus. I'm 34 and at Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in Wisconsin. Dusk feels like a hand over the mouth. The trees press in from all sides, their branches interlocking overhead like fingers, and the silence between them carries weight, the kind that makes you forget how to breathe properly. I'd driven here with my girlfriend Sarah and our friend Jake, thinking 3 days of RV camping would help us decompress from the city, from jobs that ate our souls in measured bites, from the constant buzz of notifications and deadlines. I should have known better than to trust the silence. We'd parked our rented 28-foot Winnebago at a dispersed camping spot Jake had found on some obscure forum, a clearing maybe 20 feet off an old logging road, deep enough into the forest that cell service was a distant memory. The trees here were ancient, towering white pines and oaks that had stood sentinel long before Wisconsin became a state. Their trunks disappeared into the canopy above, and when the wind moved through them, it sounded like whispered conversations in a language I didn't recognize. Sarah was already setting up the camp chairs outside the RV, her auburn hair catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the branches. She'd been quiet during the drive up, but I'd attributed that to work stress. Her marketing firm had been hemorrhaging clients, and she'd been pulling 12-hour days trying to keep accounts from jumping ship. She needed this trip more than any of us. Jake emerged from the RV carrying his guitar case, a grin splitting his bearded face. "This is it, man. This is what I was talking about. Look at this place." He gestured around us with the reverence of someone discovering a cathedral. Jake was our outdoorsman, the one who'd convinced us to try camping instead of our usual weekend routine of bars and Netflix. He'd grown up in Minnesota, spent summers at his grandfather's cabin, knew how to start fires and read weather patterns and all those practical skills that Sarah and I had never bothered learning. "It's definitely remote," Sarah said, not quite managing to hide the uncertainty in her voice. She was a city girl through and through, more comfortable navigating subway systems than forest trails. "That's the point," Jake laughed, setting down his guitar and pulling out his phone. "No bars, no Wi-Fi, no—" He stopped mid-sentence, staring at his screen with a puzzled expression. "That's weird." "What?" I asked. "I had 3 bars when we turned off the highway. Now I've got nothing. Usually it drops off gradually, but this is like hitting a wall." I checked my own phone. Same thing. No signal at all, not even emergency calls. Sarah's showed the same dead zone. "Probably just the trees," I said, though something about the sudden cutoff felt off. Cell towers didn't usually create such sharp boundaries. We spent the rest of the evening getting settled. Jake proved his outdoorsman credentials by getting a fire going with minimal fuss, while Sarah and I fumbled through setting up the outdoor kitchen. The RV's generator hummed quietly in the background, providing power for the refrigerator and lights. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to close in around our small circle of light, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once at the wall of trees surrounding us. "You guys hear that?" Sarah asked around 10 o'clock. We were sitting around the fire, Jake strumming quietly on his guitar while I nursed a beer. "Hear what?" Jake paused his playing. It sounded like, I don't know, singing, maybe. Really faint. We all listened. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, but I didn't hear any singing. "Probably just the wind," I said, but Sarah was still tilting her head, listening intently. "There it is again," she whispered. Jake and I exchanged glances. I strained to hear whatever she was picking up, but there was nothing. Just the normal sounds of a forest at night, rustling leaves, settling wood, the distant cry of some nocturnal creature. "I don't hear anything, babe," I said gently. "Maybe you're just tired? It's been a long day." Sarah looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part hurt, part confusion. "I'm not imagining it. It's like children singing, a lullaby or something. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jake stopped strumming entirely now, and we all sat in silence for a long moment. Children. Out here, miles from the nearest town, in a forest where the only sounds should be wind and wildlife. Well, Jake said finally, his voice carefully casual. Even if there were kids camping nearby, sound carries weird in the woods. Could be coming from miles away. But his eyes were scanning the tree line as he spoke, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. Sarah nodded, but she kept glancing toward the darkness beyond our fire, as if expecting to see small figures emerge from between the trees. We called it a night shortly after that. Sarah climbed into the RV's bedroom at the back while Jake took the convertible dinette and I got the overhead bunk above the cab. The generator shut off automatically at midnight, plunging us into complete darkness and silence. I was drifting off when the phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet like a scream, shrill and electronic and completely impossible. My phone was sitting on the small shelf next to my bunk, its screen blazing with an incoming call. But that was impossible. We had no signal, no bars. The phone shouldn't even be able to receive calls, let alone ring. I fumbled for it, heart hammering, and looked at the display. Unknown number. The area code wasn't one I recognized. 3 digits that seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them. Marcus? Sarah's voice drifted up from the bedroom, thick with sleep and confusion. Is that your phone? I stared at the screen. The call was still coming through, the phone vibrating insistently in my hand. Jake was stirring on the dinette below me. Yeah, I called back, though my voice came out rougher than I intended. I don't know how, though. We don't have any signal. Against every instinct screaming at me to decline the call, I swiped to answer. Hello? Silence. Not the silence of a bad connection or a dropped call, but the complete absence of sound, as if the phone had become a portal to empty space. Hello? I said again. Then, faint and distant, I heard it. My own voice saying the same word back to me. Hello? It was definitely me. Same inflection, same slight raspiness I got when I first woke up, but there was something wrong with it. Something that made my skin crawl. The voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, or from underwater, and there was an echo to it that seemed to go on longer than physics should allow. Who is this? I asked. Who is this? My voice responded, but this time there was something else underneath it. A sound like wind through dead leaves, or whispers in a language that predated words. I hung up immediately, my hands shaking. The phone's screen went dark, showing no signal bars, no indication that a call had even taken place. But my ears were still ringing with the sound of my own voice speaking words I hadn't said. Everything okay up there? Jake asked. I could hear him moving around, probably checking his own phone. Wrong number, I lied, because how do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone that you just had a conversation with yourself? I lay back down, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that distorted echo of my own voice, and I found myself straining to listen for the phone to ring again. It didn't, but somehow that was worse. The silence felt expectant now, pregnant with possibility. Morning came slowly, filtered sunlight creeping through the RV's small windows. I climbed down from my bunk to find Jake already up, standing outside with a cup of coffee and a troubled expression. Sleep okay? He asked when I joined him. Not really. You? He shook his head. Kept hearing things. Footsteps, maybe. Something moving around outside. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Did you check? With what? A flashlight? If something wanted to mess with us out here, me stumbling around in the dark with a $2 flashlight isn't going to help. He took a sip of coffee. Probably just animals anyway. Deer, maybe a bear checking us out. Sarah emerged from the bedroom looking like she'd slept about as well as we had. Her hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Did you guys hear the singing last night? She asked without preamble. Jake and I exchanged glances. When? I asked. Around 3 in the morning. It woke me up. Children's voices, definitely. And they were close, really close. Like right outside the RV. My blood turned to ice water. At 3 in the morning, I'd been lying awake listening for my phone to ring again. I hadn't heard any singing, but then again, I'd been pretty focused on other sounds. "You sure it wasn't a dream?" Jake asked gently. "I was awake," Sarah said firmly. I got up and looked out the window. I couldn't see anything, but the singing was definitely there. A lullaby, like I said before. But the words... She shuddered. The words weren't in English. What did they sound like? I asked. Old, like a language that was old before English existed. And the melody was wrong, somehow. Like it was meant to put something to sleep that shouldn't be sleeping. We stood there in uncomfortable silence, each of us probably wondering if the others thought we were losing our minds. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that there had to be explanations. Stress, imagination, the power of suggestion. But the rational part was getting quieter, drowned out by a growing sense that we were in a place where rational explanations didn't hold much weight. "Look," Jake said finally, "we're all spooked. It's our first night camping. We're in an unfamiliar place. Our minds are playing tricks on us. Let's just take things as they come, okay? If we really don't feel safe, we can pack up and leave." Sarah nodded, but she kept glancing toward the trees as if expecting to see small figures watching us from between the trunks. We spent the day hiking some of the nearby trails, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. The forest was beautiful in daylight. Towering pines, carpets of ferns, streams that bubbled over moss-covered rocks. But there was something oppressive about it too, as if the trees were leaning in to listen to our conversations, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around noon, we came across an old ranger station that wasn't marked on any of our maps. It was a small log building, maybe 20 feet square, with broken windows and a roof that sagged ominously. The door hung open on rusted hinges. "This isn't supposed to be here," Jake said, consulting his GPS unit. The device had been working fine for navigation, even without cell service. "According to this, we're in the middle of empty forest." "Maybe it's really old," Sarah suggested, "from before GPS mapping." But something about the building felt wrong. The logs were darkened with age and weather, but they didn't look like they'd been abandoned for decades. There was no rust on the metal roof beyond what you'd expect from a few seasons of neglect. And the clearing around it was too perfect, too circular, as if the trees had been told to grow in a specific pattern. "Let's check it out," Jake said, but I grabbed his arm. "Maybe we shouldn't." "Why not? It's just an old building." I couldn't explain the dread that washed over me when I looked at that open doorway. It was like staring into the mouth of something vast and hungry. It just feels wrong. Sarah was already walking toward the building, drawn by the same curiosity that had probably killed countless cats. "There's something written over the door," she called back to us. Jake and I followed reluctantly. Above the doorway, carved deep into the log lintel, were symbols that looked like they'd been made with claws rather than tools. They didn't match any alphabet I recognized. They looked organic somehow, like writing that had grown rather than been created. "What language is that?" Jake asked. "I don't think it's a language," I said. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them directly, and staring at them too long made my head hurt. Sarah stepped through the doorway before either of us could stop her. For a moment, she was silhouetted against the darkness inside, and then she disappeared into the shadows. "Sarah," I called, but there was no response. Jake and I rushed to the doorway. The interior of the ranger station was larger than it should have been. Much larger. The walls seemed to stretch away into darkness that our eyes couldn't penetrate, and the air inside carried the smell of damp earth and something else, something organic and unpleasant. "Sarah, where are you?" Jake shouted. Her voice came back to us from somewhere deep in the darkness, but it sounded strange, echoing in a space that shouldn't exist. "I'm here. You need to see this." Against every instinct screaming at us to run, we stepped inside. The darkness was absolute. Our flashlights, which had been working perfectly moments before, cast weak, sickly beams that seemed to be absorbed by the air itself. We followed the sound of Sarah's voice deeper into the building, though "building" was no longer an accurate description. We were walking through tunnels now, carved from living rock, the walls damp and pulsing with a rhythm that matched a massive, slow heartbeat. "Sarah!" I called again, and this time her response came from right beside us. "I'm here," she said, but when I turned toward her voice, she wasn't there. "Sarah, where are you?" Jake's voice was tight with panic now. "I'm right here," she said again, and this time the voice was coming from behind us. But when we spun around, there was only empty tunnel stretching back the way we'd come. That's when I realized we were lost. The tunnel behind us looked exactly like the tunnel ahead of us, and I couldn't remember which direction we'd come from. Worse, I couldn't remember how long we'd been walking. It felt like minutes, but it also felt like hours. "This is impossible," Jake whispered. "The building was 20 feet square. We can't have walked more than 50 feet in any direction." "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice echoing off walls that seemed to absorb sound and throw it back distorted. "Sarah!" Her laughter came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that started normal and then stretched into something inhuman, something that went on far longer than human lungs could sustain. And then, suddenly, we were outside again, standing in the clearing in front of the ranger station. Sarah was there too, standing exactly where she'd been when she'd first spotted the symbols above the door. "There's something written over the door," she said, as if she hadn't just spoken those exact words 5 minutes ago. Jake and I stared at her in horror. "Sarah," I said carefully, "we just followed you inside. We just spent—" I looked at my watch. The hands were spinning wildly as if time itself had become unstuck. "We were looking for you." She turned to look at us with genuine confusion. "Inside? I haven't gone inside. I just got here." The symbols above the door were different now. Where before they'd looked like organic scratches, now they resembled letters. Letters that spelled out words in a language I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. And as I watched, they continued to change, shifting and rearranging themselves like living things. "We need to go," I said. "Right now." For once, Jake didn't argue. We practically dragged Sarah away from the ranger station, back down the trail toward our campsite. But even as we walked, I could feel the building behind us, watching, waiting. And when I risked a glance back, the symbols above the door had rearranged themselves into words I could read. "Welcome home." That evening, we sat around the campfire in tense silence. Sarah kept insisting she had no memory of going inside the ranger station, and her confusion seemed genuine. But Jake and I remembered every terrifying moment. The impossible interior, her voice leading us deeper into darkness, the way time had seemed to break down entirely. "Maybe we should leave in the morning," Sarah said quietly. "This place feels wrong." I was about to agree when my phone rang. The same impossible ring, cutting through the night like a blade. Unknown number, area code that seemed to shift when I looked at it. But this time, I wasn't the only one hearing it. "Your phone's ringing," Jake said unnecessarily. "We don't have signal," Sarah pointed out, though her voice was hollow with the knowledge that logic had stopped applying to our situation. I looked at the screen. The call was coming through, just like before. The rational thing would be to decline it, to turn the phone off entirely. But rationality was a luxury we'd left behind somewhere between the ranger station and the symbols that had spelled out a welcome that felt more like a threat. I answered the call. "Hello?" This time, there was no delay. My own voice responded immediately, clear and close as if I were standing right next to myself. "Hello, Marcus." The voice was mine, but the inflection was wrong. It was too calm, too knowing, like someone who had learned to imitate my speech patterns but didn't understand the emotions behind them. "Who is this?" I asked. "I'm you," the voice said simply. Or, I will be. It's hard to explain. Jake and Sarah were staring at me with expressions of growing horror. They could hear both sides of the conversation clearly, as if the phone were on speaker. "That's impossible," I said. "Is it?" the other Marcus asked. "You've seen the ranger station. You've walked through tunnels that can't exist inside a building that can't be as large as it is. You've heard children singing in a forest where no children should be. Why is this the impossible thing? What do you want?" "To warn you," my voice said, and now there was something like sadness in it. "You need to leave. Tonight. Right now. Don't pack, don't gather your things. Just get in the RV and drive. Drive until you hit the highway and then keep driving until you're back in the city. Why? Because if you stay, you'll become like me. And trust me, Marcus, you don't want to be like me. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, my hands shaking. What the hell was that? Jake whispered. Before I could answer, my phone rang again. Same, unknown number. This time I hesitated for several rings before answering. Hello? You didn't leave. This time, the voice sounded disappointed but not surprised. We were just... It's too late now, the other Marcus interrupted. They've seen you. They know you're here. You can't leave anymore. Who's seen us? Who knows we're here? But the line was already dead. Jake grabbed his own phone and tried calling 911, but his screen showed the same no-signal message we'd been dealing with since we arrived. Sarah was backing toward the RV, her eyes wide with terror. We need to go, she said. Right now. We pack the essentials and we leave. I nodded, but as we turned toward the RV, we saw them. Children, a dozen of them, maybe more, standing at the edge of our campsite where the firelight faded into darkness. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, long white nightgowns and dark wool coats that looked like they belonged in a museum. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. And they were singing, the lullaby Sarah had been hearing, but now we could all hear it clearly. It was in that same ancient language we'd heard whispered beneath my own voice on the phone, and the melody was haunting and wrong, designed to soothe something that shouldn't exist. Don't look at them, Sarah whispered, but it was too late. We were all staring, transfixed by the sight of these impossible children standing just beyond our circle of light. One of them stepped forward. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with long dark hair that hung in front of her face. When she spoke, her voice was clear and sweet and absolutely terrifying. "Why didn't you listen to him?" she asked. "Listen to who?" I managed to say. "The other you. He tried to warn you. They always try to warn, but nobody ever listens. What do you want?" The little girl tilted her head, considering the question. Want is a funny word. Do we want? Do the trees want? Does the wind want? She smiled, and her teeth were too sharp. We need, and you have what we need. What's that? Stories, she said simply. We're so old, and we've heard all our stories so many times, but you have new ones, fresh ones. Stories about cities and machines and people who think they understand the world. More children were emerging from the darkness now, dozens of them, forming a circle around our campsite. They continued their wordless lullaby, and the sound of it was starting to make my head feel heavy, my thoughts thick and slow. "We don't understand," Jake said, though his voice was slurring slightly. "You will," the little girl promised. "You'll understand everything once you're like us. Once you've been here long enough to forget what you used to be." "We won't stay," Sarah said, but even as she spoke the words I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. The lullaby was affecting her too, making her sway slightly on her feet. "Oh, but you will," the girl laughed. "You already have. Look around you." I turned, fighting against the growing lethargy, and saw that our campsite had changed. The RV was still there, but it looked older now, covered in rust and moss. Our camping chairs were rotted. Our fire had burned down to cold ashes. And when I looked at my watch, the hands were spinning wildly again. But this time I could see decades passing, years cycling like seconds. "Time moves differently here," the girl explained patiently. "We exist in the spaces between moments, in the pause between heartbeats. You've been here for minutes, but also for years. Eventually, you'll forget which is which." The lullaby was getting louder now, more children joining in, and I could feel myself starting to drift. But through the fog, I heard my phone ringing again. I answered without thinking. "Marcus," it was my voice again, but different this time. Urgent, desperate. "Fight it. The song is how they catch you. Cover your ears, close your eyes, don't listen." "I can't," I mumbled. My hands felt like they belonged to someone else. "You have to. If you let them finish the song, you'll become one of them. Is that what you want? To spend eternity luring other people into the woods?" The question cut through the fog like a knife. I looked around at the children, really looked at them, and for a moment I could see through their disguise. They weren't children at all. They were things that had been human once, long ago, before the forest had claimed them and changed them into something else. Their eyes held the accumulated weight of centuries, and their smiles were the expressions of predators who had forgotten what it felt like to be prey. "Sarah," I called, forcing my voice to work. "Jake, don't listen to the song." But when I turned to look at them, they were already changing. Sarah's skin was taking on that translucent quality, and Jake's eyes were beginning to reflect the firelight. They were swaying with the music, their lips starting to move along with words in a language they'd never learned. My phone was still connected, my other self still talking. "There's only one way out," he was saying, "but you're not going to like it. Tell me." "The ranger station. You have to go back inside, find the heart of it. But this time, don't follow the voices. Go the other way. Find the room with the mirrors." "What's in the room with the mirrors?" "The truth. But Marcus, whatever you do in there, don't look at yourself. Don't look at any of the reflections. Just find the one that's different and break it." The call ended. I looked around at the circle of not children, at Sarah and Jake who were slowly transforming into something inhuman, at the campsite that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. And I made the hardest decision of my life. I ran. I left Sarah and Jake there with those things, abandoned them to whatever fate awaited in that circle of predators, and sprinted into the darkness toward the ranger station. Behind me, the lullaby faltered and then rose in anger. No longer soothing, but sharp and commanding. The ranger station appeared ahead of me faster than it should have, as if the forest were folding in on itself to bring me to my destination. The symbols above the door were different again, shifting and changing even as I watched, and they hurt to look at directly. I plunged through the doorway without hesitation. This time, I didn't follow the tunnels that led deeper into the earth. When the passage split, I went right instead of left, up instead of down, toward what felt like the heart of the building rather than its depths. The walls here were covered in mirrors, some small and handheld, others large enough to reflect a full body. They lined the tunnel like windows, but they didn't show my reflection. Instead, they showed me other versions of myself. In one mirror, I was still sitting around the campfire, slowly changing as the lullaby worked its magic on my mind. In another, I was older, dressed in the same old-fashioned clothes as the children, standing at the edge of someone else's campsite and singing the same haunting melody. But there was one mirror that was different. Instead of showing me, it showed the forest from above, as if I were looking down from an impossible height. I could see our campsite, the circle of not children, Sarah and Jake still swaying to their song. And I could see myself, running through tunnels that existed both inside and outside the ranger station. I raised my fist and smashed the mirror. The glass shattered, and suddenly I was falling. Not down, but up, through layers of reality that peeled away like old paint. I fell through decades, through centuries, through the accumulated weight of stories that the forest had collected from travelers who had made the mistake of stopping in places where they shouldn't stop. I hit the ground hard, gasping and bruised, and found myself lying in our campsite. But it was our campsite as it had been when we'd first arrived. Clean camping chairs, fresh fire, the RV gleaming in the firelight. Sarah and Jake were there too, but they were normal again, human again, looking around in confusion. "What happened?" Sarah asked. "I feel like I just woke up from the strangest dream." Jake was checking his phone. "I've got signal," he said wonderingly. 3 bars. When did that come back? I checked my own phone. Full signal, the time showing normally, no missed calls from impossible numbers, but in my pocket I could feel something else. A piece of glass from the mirror I'd broken, sharp and warm against my palm. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." This time, they didn't argue. We packed in record time, throwing gear into the RV without worrying about organization or care. As we drove away from the campsite, I kept checking the mirrors. Not because I was worried about traffic, but because I needed to make sure nothing was following us. We made it to the highway without incident, and from there back to the city. Sarah and Jake attributed their strange memories to stress and imagination. and I let them believe it. What else could I do? Tell them the truth? Explain that we'd narrowly escaped becoming eternal predators in a forest that existed in the spaces between moments? But I kept the piece of mirror glass, and sometimes, late at night when I'm having trouble sleeping, I take it out and look at it. Most of the time it just shows my reflection, normal and unremarkable. But occasionally it shows me other things. It shows me the forest and the campsite where we almost died. It shows me the not children, still there, still singing their lullaby for travelers who don't know enough to ignore the sound of children's voices in places where no children should be. And sometimes it shows me the other Marcus, the one who called to warn me, who had clearly made different choices in his version of events. He looks older now, more tired, but he's still human, still himself, and when he sees me looking back at him through the glass, he smiles and nods, as if to say that yes, we made the right choice. Yes, we escaped. Yes, we're safe. But the glass also shows me Sarah and Jake, and they don't look the same in the reflection as they do in real life. In the mirror, their eyes hold depths that human eyes shouldn't have, and their smiles are just a little too wide, just a little too knowing. Sometimes I think we didn't all make it out of that forest. Sometimes I think only one of us escaped, and the others were replaced by things that learned to wear human faces and speak in human voices and exist in the normal world without anyone noticing the difference. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with the mirror glass, I wonder if I'm the real Marcus at all, or if I'm just another reflection, another echo of someone who made the mistake of stopping at a campsite where ancient things sing lullabies to lure the living into their eternal choir. The piece of glass grows warm in my hand when I think thoughts like these, and if I listen carefully, I can hear singing, faint and distant, but definitely there. Children's voices, carrying a melody that promises rest and peace and an end to all the confusing complexities of human existence. I know I should throw the glass away. Forget about that night in the forest. Pretend it was all just a shared hallucination brought on by stress and unfamiliar surroundings. But I can't. Because sometimes when the singing gets loud enough, I remember what it felt like to have all my questions answered, to understand my place in a story much larger and older than anything I'd ever imagined. And in those moments, I find myself humming along. Story 2. My name is Marcus. I'm 34. And I learned at the Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming that some things refuse to stay dead, even when you put a bullet through their heart. I'd been planning this trip for months, just me and Sarah in our new 28-foot Winnebago, heading out to see the Black Hills before the autumn crowds descended. We'd been married 3 years, and this was supposed to be our celebration trip. Our chance to reconnect after the miscarriage in June had left us both walking on eggshells around each other. Sarah had been the one to suggest Devil's Tower specifically. She'd read somewhere that the Native Americans considered it sacred, a place of healing. I should have paid more attention to why they considered it sacred. We pulled into the Devil's Gulch RV park just as the sun was painting the tower's monolithic face in shades of amber and blood. The campground was mostly empty. Mid-September in Wyoming tends to thin out the tourists, with only a handful of other RVs scattered among the cottonwoods. Our site backed up to Belle Fourche River, and beyond that, the dense forest that sprawled toward the monument itself. "It's beautiful," Sarah said as we leveled the RV, her voice carrying the first genuine warmth I'd heard from her in weeks. She'd been so quiet since the loss, retreating into herself in a way that made me feel like I was losing her too. "Look how the light hits the tower." I looked. The geological formation rose like a massive tree stump against the darkening sky, its vertical striations catching the last rays of sunlight. Something about it made my stomach twist, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way it seemed to loom over everything, or how the shadows at its base appeared to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Yeah," I agreed, hooking up the electrical. "Definitely impressive." We spent the evening setting up camp and cooking dinner on the propane grill. Sarah seemed more like herself than she had in months, laughing at my failed attempts to start the fire and stealing sips of my beer when she thought I wasn't looking. For the first time since June, I felt hopeful about us. That first night, I woke to the sound of something large moving outside our bedroom window. The RV was parked so that our bed faced the forest, and through the thin curtains I could see a dark shape silhouetted against the trees. At first, I thought it might be an elk. They were common in the area, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was too tall, too angular. It looked like a deer, but wrong somehow. Its neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, and even in the darkness I could see something dark dripping from its mouth. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Sarah, and moved to the window for a better look. The creature stood motionless about 20 feet from our RV, its head tilted in that horrible twisted position, staring directly at our window. Its eyes reflected the faint starlight like mirrors, and I could see now that the dark substance wasn't just dripping from its mouth, it was flowing freely down its chest and legs, pooling in the grass beneath it. Blood. The deer was bleeding from multiple wounds, deep gashes across its flanks and neck, yet it stood there as if nothing was wrong. I reached for my phone to take a picture, but when I looked back up, the deer was gone. Just gone, as if it had never been there at all. The only evidence of its presence was a dark stain on the grass where it had been standing. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, I mentioned the deer to Sarah over coffee, trying to keep my tone casual. She raised an eyebrow but didn't seem overly concerned. Maybe it was injured and looking for help, she suggested. Wild animals do that sometimes when they're desperate. I nodded, though something told me that wasn't what I'd seen. Injured animals might seek shelter, but they didn't stand perfectly still while bleeding to death. And they certainly didn't stare at you with that kind of intelligence. We spent the day hiking around the monument itself, following the tower trail that circled the base of the massive rock formation. Sarah brought her camera and took pictures of everything. The prairie dogs, the climbers scaling the tower's face, the strange bundles of cloth tied to trees along the path. Prayer bundles, an elderly park ranger explained when Sarah asked. The local tribes consider this a sacred place. The Lakota call it Mato Tipila, Bear Lodge. According to legend, it was formed when a giant bear clawed at the rock trying to reach 7 sisters who had climbed to the top to escape it. What happened to the sisters? Sarah asked. The ranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. They became the stars of the Big Dipper. Some say they're still up there, watching over the sacred ground. That evening, we decided to have a campfire by the river. I'd bought firewood from the camp store, and Sarah had picked up marshmallows for s'mores. It felt good to do something normal, something that reminded us of who we used to be together. The fire crackled pleasantly as darkness fell, and we sat close on our folding chairs, Sarah's head on my shoulder. For a while, everything felt perfect. Then I heard it. A rustling in the bushes across the river. Did you hear that? I asked, lifting my head. Sarah listened for a moment. Just the wind in the trees. But I knew the difference between wind and something moving deliberately through undergrowth. I kept watching the tree line, and after a few minutes I saw it again. The deer standing just at the edge of the firelight's reach. This time I could see it more clearly. The wounds were worse than I'd thought. Great tears in its hide revealed glimpses of white bone and dark cavity. Its front right leg hung useless, bent at an impossible angle. Yet it bore weight on it as if nothing was wrong. And its neck, God, its neck was nearly severed, the head hanging by what looked like sinew and stubborn will. Sarah, I whispered, pointing across the water. She looked where I was pointing and gasped. Oh my God, that poor thing. We should call someone, a ranger or a veterinarian. But even as she spoke, the deer turned and walked deeper into the forest, its movements smooth and deliberate despite its horrific injuries. Within seconds, it had vanished into the shadows. Did you see the wounds? I asked. Sarah nodded, her face pale in the firelight. How is it even standing? Those looked fresh. We extinguished the fire early that night and went inside. I double-checked all the locks on the RV doors, though I couldn't say why. What was a lock going to do against a deer, injured or otherwise? Around 3 a.m., I woke to a sound I couldn't immediately identify. It was rhythmic, like someone tapping against the RV's exterior wall. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. I lay still, listening, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen area near the door. Sarah was still asleep beside me, her breathing deep and even. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I slipped out of bed and crept toward the sound. The RV's small windows made it difficult to see outside, but I pressed my face to the kitchen window and peered out into the darkness. The deer stood directly beside our door, its ruined head pressed against the RV's side. With each tap, it was gently bumping its skull against the aluminum siding. Its eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking, and that steady flow of blood continued to pour from its wounds. I watched, transfixed and horrified as the creature repeated its rhythmic tapping. There was something almost hypnotic about it, something that made me want to open the door and step outside. My hand actually moved toward the handle before I caught myself. What the hell was I thinking? I backed away from the window, my heart hammering. The tapping continued for another 10 minutes before it finally stopped. When I looked out again, the deer was gone. In the morning, I found the blood. Dark, thick stains streaked down the side of the RV where the deer had been pressing its head. The metallic smell was overwhelming, and flies had already begun to gather. Jesus Christ, I muttered, staring at the mess. What's wrong? Sarah asked, emerging from the RV with her coffee mug. She saw the blood and went white. Is that from the deer? I confirmed. It was here last night, right outside our door. Sarah set down her mug with trembling hands. Maybe we should pack up and leave. This doesn't feel right, Marcus. Something's wrong with that animal. I wanted to agree with her, but we'd paid for a week at the campground, and the rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation. Injured animals could behave strangely. Maybe it was sick or rabid. Maybe it was seeking shelter and didn't understand that our RV wasn't a safe place. Let me call the rangers, I said. They'll know what to do. I called the Park Service and spoke to a ranger named Collins. I described the deer, its injuries, and its strange behavior. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Can you describe the wounds again? Collins asked. I did, in as much detail as I could remember. Another pause. Mr. Patterson, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you absolutely certain this was a deer, not an elk or some other animal? I'm certain. White-tailed deer, adult doe. But why does that matter? Collins sighed. Because 3 days ago, we found a deer matching that exact description about 2 miles from your campground. It had been killed by what looked like a large predator. Mountain lion, most likely. The wounds you described match the carcass we found. My mouth went dry. That's impossible. I saw it last night. It was moving around, bleeding, but definitely alive. Sir, I'm looking at photos of that deer right now. It's been dead for at least 4 days, probably longer. The carcass is in advanced decomposition. After I hung up, I told Sarah what Collins had said. She stared at me for a long moment, then walked to the window and looked out at the bloodstains. So, what did we see? She asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. That afternoon, we drove into the nearby town of Devil's Tower to get supplies and maybe ask around about the deer. The town was small, just a few streets clustered around the monument's base, but it had a gas station, a gift shop, and a small diner called the Sacred Ground Cafe. We ordered coffee and pie, and I struck up a conversation with the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Beth who looked like she'd lived in the area her whole life. You folks camping up at the RV park? She asked while refilling our cups. Yeah, beautiful spot, Sarah said, though we've been having some strange encounters with a deer. Beth's expression changed immediately. Her friendly smile faded, and she glanced around the nearly empty diner before leaning closer to our table. What kind of encounters? I described what we'd seen, leaving out the part about the ranger's phone call. Beth listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious with each detail. You need to leave, she said when I finished. Pack up tonight and get out of there. Why? Sarah asked. What's going on? Beth glanced around again, then sat down across from us. That deer. You're not the first to see it. Started about 2 weeks ago, right after they found the carcass. Other campers have reported the same thing. Bleeding deer, standing outside their RVs at night tapping on the walls. Have the rangers done anything about it? What can they do? They can't arrest a ghost. The word hung in the air between us. Sarah reached for my hand under the table. You think it's... Sarah began. I think something killed that deer. Something that shouldn't have been able to, Beth said. And I think whatever killed it left something behind. Something that won't rest. What kind of something? I asked. Beth stood up, suddenly looking uncomfortable. The Lakota have stories about this place. About things that die violent deaths near the sacred rock. Sometimes they don't stay dead, not if the death was wrong somehow. She walked away before we could ask any more questions. We drove back to the campground in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The logical part of my mind rejected everything Beth had said. Ghosts, violent deaths, sacred rocks. But the part of me that had stood at that kitchen window and watched a mortally wounded deer tap against our door wasn't so sure. That evening, we debated leaving. Sarah was all for packing up and heading home, but I convinced her to stay one more night. I told her I wanted to get to the bottom of what was happening, that there had to be a rational explanation. The truth was, I was scared to leave. Not scared of the deer, exactly, but scared that if we ran away now, I'd never know what I'd really seen. The uncertainty would eat at me for the rest of my life. We made another fire that night, but this time I kept my rifle close by. I'd brought it for protection against bears, but a .30-06 would stop just about anything. The weight of it across my lap was comforting. As darkness fell, I found myself scanning the tree line constantly. Sarah noticed and moved her chair closer to mine. Maybe we should go inside, she suggested around 9 o'clock. In a few minutes, I said. I want to... The rustling started again, but this time it was closer. Much closer. I could hear something moving through the brush on our side of the river, circling our campsite. Sarah grabbed my arm. Marcus, I hear it. I stood up slowly, bringing the rifle with me. Stay by the fire. The rustling stopped. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackle of burning wood and the distant murmur of the river. Then I saw movement at the edge of our campsite. A pale shape emerging from the darkness. The deer stepped into the firelight, and I nearly dropped my rifle. It was worse than before. Much worse. The wounds had opened further, exposing ribs and internal organs that glistened wetly in the orange light. Its right eye was missing entirely, leaving a dark socket that wept continuous streams of blood. The head hung at an even more severe angle, as if the neck had been nearly severed. But it moved with purpose, walking directly toward our fire with measured steps. Blood dripped steadily from its wounds, leaving a trail of dark spots on the ground. Jesus Christ, I whispered, raising the rifle. Don't, Sarah said urgently. It's already dead, remember? What's shooting it going to do? The deer stopped about 10 feet away and stood there, staring at us with its remaining eye. In the firelight, I could see things moving in its wounds. Maggots, maybe, or something worse. The smell hit me then, the sweet, sick odor of advanced decay. What do you want? I asked, feeling foolish for talking to it but unable to stop myself. The deer tilted its ruined head, as if considering my question. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. A wet, gurgling moan that sounded almost human, almost like a word. Help, it seemed to say. Help. Sarah made a choked sound behind me. The deer took another step forward, leaving more bloody prints in the dirt. I had the rifle aimed at its head, my finger on the trigger, but I couldn't bring myself to fire. What was the point? If Collins was right, if this thing was already dead, what would a bullet accomplish? The deer moaned again, that horrible wet sound that might have been speech. This time I could swear it said, "Please." "Please what?" I whispered. The deer turned its head toward the forest, then back to us. It took a few steps in that direction, stopped, and looked back. The message was clear. It wanted us to follow. "Absolutely not," Sarah said, as if reading my thoughts. "We are not following that thing into the woods." But I was already standing up, still holding the rifle. Something about the deer's behavior, the way it had said, "please," made me think it wasn't trying to hurt us. It was trying to communicate something. "Marcus, no," Sarah pleaded. "It wants to show us something," I said. "Maybe." Maybe if we follow it, find out what it wants, this will stop. Or maybe it wants to lead us somewhere we can't come back from. The deer waited patiently while we argued, blood pooling around its hooves. Finally, it turned and began walking toward the tree line. After a few yards, it stopped and looked back at us. Against every rational thought in my head, I started to follow. Sarah grabbed my arm, but I shook her off gently. "Stay here," I told her. "Keep the fire going. If I'm not back in an hour, drive to town and get help." "I'm not leaving you alone with that thing." "Sarah." "No, we stick together. That's what marriage means, right? For better or for worse." So we followed the dead deer into the forest. It led us along what might have been a game trail, though it was too dark to be sure. I kept my rifle ready and used my phone's flashlight to illuminate the path ahead. The deer moved slowly, as if aware of our limitations, stopping frequently to make sure we were still behind it. The smell of decay followed us like a cloud. Sarah walked close behind me, one hand on my shoulder, breathing through her mouth to avoid the worst of it. After about 20 minutes of walking, we came to a small clearing. In the center stood an old cottonwood tree, its trunk scarred and blackened as if it had been struck by lightning multiple times. The deer stopped at the base of the tree and looked back at us. "This is it?" I asked. "This is what you wanted to show us?" The deer walked to the far side of the tree and stood there, perfectly still. I followed, Sarah close behind me, and shined my light on the area where it was standing. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then Sarah gasped and pointed at the base of the tree. Bones. Old bones, bleached white and scattered around the cottonwood's roots. Some were clearly animal. Ribs, leg bones, skulls with antlers. But others looked distinctly human. "My God," Sarah whispered. "What is this place?" I knelt down and examined the bones more closely. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all mixed together in a gruesome pile. Some showed signs of trauma, cracks, breaks, what looked like bite marks. The deer made that wet, gurgling sound again, and when I looked up, it was staring directly at me. Its remaining eye seemed to hold intelligence, purpose. "You were killed here," I said, though I felt ridiculous talking to a dead animal. "Someone or something killed you here, along with all these other animals." The deer's head moved in what might have been a nod. "But why show us this? What do you want us to do?" The deer turned and walked to another part of the clearing, near a cluster of rocks. It stood there and made that moaning sound again. I followed and shined my light on the area. More bones, but these were different, fresher, and nestled among them, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A small, partially decomposed hand, still wearing a wedding ring. "Sarah," I called quietly. "Come here." She joined me, took one look at what my light was illuminating, and vomited into the bushes. It wasn't just animal bones. Someone had been using this clearing as a dumping ground for human remains. The deer hadn't been killed by a mountain lion. It had been killed by whoever was responsible for this charnel house. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, wiping her mouth. "We need to call the police." I was already reaching for my phone when I heard it, the snap of a branch behind us. I spun around, rifle raised, and my flashlight beam caught a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a man, tall and gaunt, wearing dirty coveralls and carrying what looked like a machete. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his teeth gleaming in a wide grin. "Well, well," he said in a voice like grinding gravel. "Looks like my little friend brought me some new visitors." The deer was gone. I hadn't seen it leave, but when I glanced around the clearing, there was no sign of it anywhere. "Run," I whispered to Sarah, but the man heard me. Now, no need for that," he said, stepping into the clearing. "You've already seen too much to leave. Might as well make this easy on everyone." He raised the machete, and I fired. The .30-06 round took him center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. He lay there motionless for several seconds, and I thought I'd killed him. Then he started laughing. "That hurt," he said, sitting up. There was blood on his coveralls, but not nearly as much as there should have been. "Been a while since someone shot me. Almost forgot what it felt like." He stood up, seemingly unaffected by the bullet wound, and started walking toward us again. I fired twice more, both shots hitting center mass, but he kept coming. The bullets might as well have been spitballs for all the effect they had. "Sarah, run!" I shouted, backpedaling toward the tree line. We crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Behind us, I could hear the man laughing, but he didn't seem to be pursuing us. Maybe he thought the forest would do his work for him. We ran blindly through the darkness, following what we hoped was the trail back to our campsite. I kept my phone's light trained on the ground, looking for the markers we'd passed on the way in, but everything looked the same in the dark. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we stumbled back into our campsite. The fire had burned down to coals, but it was still enough light to see by. We didn't stop to gather our things, just threw ourselves into the RV and locked the doors. I started the engine with shaking hands while Sarah called 911 on her phone. There was no signal. "Nothing," she said. "We're too remote." "We'll drive to town," I said, putting the RV in gear. "Call the police from there." But as I started to pull out of our campsite, the headlights illuminated something that made me slam on the brakes. The deer stood directly in front of us, its wounds gleaming wetly in the harsh light. But it wasn't alone. There were others with it, animals in various states of decomposition, all bearing the signs of violent death. A black bear with its throat torn open, an elk missing most of its face, smaller creatures too, rabbits, squirrels, birds, all dead but moving, all staring at our RV with empty, accusing eyes. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "There are so many of them." The dead animals began to move closer, surrounding the RV. I could hear them bumping against the sides, scratching at the windows. The deer approached the driver's side window and pressed its ruined face against the glass, leaving streaks of blood and decay. I floored the accelerator, plowing through the gathering of dead animals. I felt the RV shudder as we ran over some of them, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. We made it to the main road and drove straight to the Devil's Tower police station, a small building attached to the town hall. The officer on duty, a young man named Deputy Williams, listened to our story with increasing skepticism until I showed him the photos I'd taken of the bone pile with my phone. "Jesus," he muttered, scrolling through the images. This is a crime scene. Multiple homicides." He called for backup, and within an hour, the clearing was swarming with law enforcement. They found the bone pile exactly where we'd described it, along with evidence of at least 8 different murder victims. The man in coveralls was nowhere to be found, but they did discover a crude shelter hidden deeper in the woods, filled with tools, personal effects from victims, and journals detailing years of killing. His name was Edgar Moss, and according to the journals, he'd been using the clearing as his personal hunting ground for over a decade. He would capture hikers, campers, anyone who ventured too far into the backcountry, and bring them to the tree to kill them. The authorities found evidence linking him to over 20 missing persons cases dating back 15 years. But they never found Moss himself. Despite an extensive manhunt involving state police, federal agents, and search dogs, he seemed to have vanished into the forest. Some of the searchers reported finding strange tracks, human footprints that simply stopped in the middle of clearings, as if the person making them had suddenly taken flight. Others reported seeing him in the distance, always at the edge of their vision, watching the search parties with that same wide grin. But whenever they tried to approach, he would melt back into the trees like smoke. The deer was never found either, though several search team members reported seeing it during the manhunt. Always at a distance, always watching, always bleeding. Sarah and I gave our statements and returned home to Colorado. We never went back to Wyoming, never went camping again. Sarah couldn't sleep for months without medication, and I started seeing a therapist for the nightmares. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I think I can hear it. That wet, gurgling sound the deer made when it was trying to talk to us. And sometimes, just before dawn, I see movement in our backyard, a pale shape standing among the trees at the edge of our property, watching our house with patient, accusing eyes. The police called 6 months later to tell us they'd found Edgar Moss, or what was left of him. A hiker had discovered his remains in a ravine about 10 miles from the clearing, apparently killed by some kind of large animal. The body had been there for months, picked clean by scavengers, but the death couldn't have occurred more than a day or two after our encounter with him in the clearing, which meant Moss had been dead almost the entire time the search parties were looking for him. The officer who called couldn't explain how multiple trained searchers had seen a dead man walking through the forest. He suggested the stress of the manhunt had caused mass hallucinations, or that they'd mistaken tree stumps and shadows for human figures. I didn't argue with him. How could I explain that some things refuse to stay dead, especially when they die in places where death has been cultivated like a crop? How could I tell him that evil has a way of taking root in sacred ground and growing into something that doesn't follow the rules of the living world? Sarah and I are divorced now. The experience changed us both in ways that made it impossible to go back to who we were before. She's remarried, living in California, and we don't speak often. But when we do, neither of us mentions Wyoming. Neither of us talks about the deer. But I think about it. Every day, I think about it. About the look in its remaining eye when it led us to that clearing. About the way it seemed to nod when I said it had been murdered. About how it vanished the moment Moss appeared, as if its job was done. I think the deer was trying to tell us something that night. Not just about the murders, but about justice. About how sometimes the dead have to take care of their own business because the living world isn't enough. Edgar Moss thought he could kill with impunity in that sacred place, thought the isolation would protect him, but the land remembered every death, every drop of spilled blood. And eventually, the debt came due. I never found out what killed Moss in that ravine. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, but the pattern of wounds didn't match any known predator in the region. The forensic report mentioned extensive trauma to the throat and neck, consistent with multiple bite wounds from something with human-like teeth, something that might have had a lot of practice biting after spending months with its own throat torn open. I still live in Colorado, in the same house Sarah and I shared. I've thought about moving, but somehow I don't think it would matter. Some connections can't be broken by distance. Last week I found a deer skull in my backyard, placed carefully on the picnic table we never use anymore. It was old, bleached white by years of weather, but the bones were arranged with deliberate care, almost like an offering, or a reminder. I buried the skull that same day, but the next morning it was back on the table. This time, there was something else with it. A small piece of paper, water-stained and torn, with 2 words written in what looked like dried blood. Thank you. I keep the paper in my wallet now, though I'm not sure why. Maybe because it's the only proof I have that what happened at Devil's Tower was real. Maybe because it reminds me that some debts transcend death, and some justice comes with teeth and claws and the patience of the grave. Or maybe because I know the story isn't over yet. The deer found me once, led me to where I needed to be. And deep down, in the part of my mind that still wakes up at 3 a.m. expecting to hear tapping on the walls, I know it's still out there, still watching, still bleeding, still waiting for the next person who needs to understand that some places are sacred because of what's buried beneath them. And some animals refuse to stay dead until their killers join them in the ground. The debt is paid, but the ledger stays open, and somewhere in the forests of Wyoming a dead deer keeps its vigil, waiting for the next Edgar Moss to make the mistake of thinking he can kill without consequence in a place where the very earth remembers blood. I should have listened to Sarah that first night when she said we should leave. But then again, maybe we were never supposed to leave. Maybe the deer had been calling us there all along, waiting for someone to witness what had been done, to make sure the world knew that Edgar Moss hadn't just vanished into the forest. He'd joined it, permanently. And every night since then, when I close my eyes, I can still see that deer standing at the edge of our campfire's light, its ruined head tilted in question, its remaining eye fixed on mine with the weight of unfinished business. Some things refuse to stay dead. I learned that at Devil's Tower. I learned it, and I'll never forget it. Story 3. My name is Marcus. I'm 34, and I discovered the cave in Olympic National Forest while trying to escape the memory of Sarah's funeral 3 months earlier. The ranger map I'd picked up at the Sol Duke entrance showed the standard hiking trails threading through old-growth timber. But when I parked my rented RV at the primitive campground near the Ho River, my feet chose a different path entirely, one that led me to a limestone opening that hummed with a sound like distant machinery. I'd come to Washington to think, or maybe to stop thinking. The divorce papers were still warm in my glove compartment, signed the day after we buried our daughter. Leukemia doesn't give you time to prepare, and grief doesn't give you permission to breathe. Sarah had been gone 3 months, and Jennifer had moved out 2 weeks ago, taking nothing but her clothes and a photograph of Sarah blowing out 6 candles. The RV was a last-minute rental, a 32-foot Winnebago that handled like a drunk elephant on the mountain roads. I'd never driven anything bigger than a pickup truck, but something about the contained space appealed to me. 4 walls, a bed, a kitchenette, everything I needed to disappear for a while. The campground was nearly empty in late October. A few die-hard campers had pitched tents near the river, but most folks had the sense to stay home when the Pacific Northwest turned cold and wet. I'd lucked into a spot surrounded by towering Douglas firs, their tops lost in the perpetual mist that hung over this part of the forest. I spent the first day just sitting in the driver's seat, engine off, listening to rain drum against the windshield. The sound reminded me of Sarah's fingers tapping on the hospital bed rail when she was bored, which had been often during those final weeks. The chemo had stolen her energy but not her restlessness. By the second morning, the walls of the RV felt like they were closing in. I needed to move, to put distance between myself and the small space that already smelled like my own stagnation. I laced up my hiking boots, bought new for this trip, still stiff and unbroken, and headed into the forest without a destination in mind. The official trails were well marked, but I found myself stepping over rope barriers and ducking under "trail closed for maintenance" signs. I told myself I was looking for solitude, but the truth was I wanted to get lost. I wanted the forest to swallow me whole, to make me small enough that the grief couldn't find me. The trees here were ancient, some older than Christ, their trunks wider than my RV. Moss draped everything in green velvet, and the air tasted of decay and growing things. I walked for hours, following game trails and creek beds, until I realized I had no idea which direction led back to the campground. That's when I heard it, a low, steady humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. At first, I thought it might be a generator, maybe some kind of geological monitoring equipment the Park Service had installed. But as I followed the sound, pushing through walls of fern and salmonberry, I realized it was too organic, too rhythmic to be mechanical. The cave mouth appeared suddenly, a dark slash in a limestone cliff face I hadn't seen until I was almost standing in it. The opening was maybe 8 feet tall and twice as wide, shaped like a mouth caught mid-scream, and from deep inside came that humming, constant and hypnotic. I stood at the entrance for a long time, listening. The sound rose and fell like breathing, but underneath it was something else, a harmony, as if multiple voices were joining in from different chambers deep underground. It was beautiful and wrong at the same time, like a lullaby played at the wrong speed. I had my phone, but no signal this deep in the forest. I had a small LED flashlight on my keychain, but its beam barely penetrated the darkness beyond the cave mouth. Every rational part of my brain said to turn around, mark the location somehow, and come back with proper equipment. Instead, I stepped inside. The humming grew louder immediately, echoing off stone walls that my tiny light couldn't reach. The cave floor was smooth limestone, worn by centuries of water flow, and it sloped gently downward. The air was warmer here than outside, and it carried a smell I couldn't identify, something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in water. I followed the main passage, trailing my left hand along the wall for guidance. The stone was dry and oddly warm to the touch. Every 20 feet or so, smaller passages branched off into deeper darkness, and from each one came a slightly different tone, as if the cave were a massive organ with pipes of varying length. The passage curved to the right, then split into 3 tunnels. The humming was loudest from the middle passage, so I chose that one, though something made me hesitate at the threshold. The sound was more complex here, layered with harmonics that seemed almost like words if I listened carefully enough. 50 feet down the middle tunnel, my flashlight beam caught something that made me stop dead. Carved into the wall, about chest high, was a symbol I'd never seen before. A spiraling pattern that seemed to move in the LED's shifting light. Below it, in letters that looked freshly cut, was a single word: deeper. I should have turned around then. I should have run. But grief makes you reckless, and part of me welcomed the idea of disappearing into the dark. Sarah was dead, Jennifer was gone, and I was 34 years old with nothing left to lose. If the cave wanted to swallow me, maybe that was exactly what I needed. The tunnel continued to slope downward, and the humming grew more complex with each step. I began to pick out individual voices in the chorus, high, sweet tones that could have been children singing, deeper notes that resonated in my chest. The temperature continued to rise, and I found myself sweating despite the October chill I'd left on the surface. After what felt like an hour of walking, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. My flashlight beam couldn't find the far walls or the ceiling, but it did illuminate the source of at least some of the humming. Crystalline formations that jutted from the floor like frozen lightning. Each one vibrated with its own frequency, creating the symphony I'd been following. But that wasn't what made me forget to breathe. Scattered among the crystal formations were sleeping bags, dozens of them, arranged in rough circles throughout the chamber. Most were empty, their zippers pulled wide like screaming mouths. But a few were occupied, and from those came the sound of steady breathing that perfectly matched the cave's rhythm. I approached the nearest occupied bag carefully, my heart hammering against my ribs. The person inside was completely still, and when I knelt and gently shook the sleeping bag, there was no response. I found the zipper and slowly pulled it down. The face that emerged was a woman's, maybe 40 years old, with long dark hair spread across an inflatable pillow. Her eyes were closed, and she was breathing slowly and deeply, but when I called out to her, she didn't respond. Her skin was warm to the touch, and her pulse was strong and steady when I checked her wrist. She was alive, but unreachable, lost in whatever dream the cave was providing. I checked 3 more occupied sleeping bags and found the same thing. Healthy adults in some kind of deep, unnatural sleep. Their clothes were hiking gear, their backpacks neatly arranged beside their bedrolls. These weren't homeless people who'd wandered into the cave seeking shelter. These were hikers like me, people who'd heard the humming and followed it down into the earth. That's when I noticed my own breathing had begun to synchronize with theirs. The cave's rhythm was infectious, working its way into my nervous system like a drug. My eyelids felt heavy despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, and the humming no longer seemed threatening. It seemed welcoming, maternal, like the sound Sarah used to make when she sang herself to sleep. I shook my head hard, biting down on my tongue until I tasted blood. The pain cleared my thoughts momentarily, but the drowsiness returned within seconds. Whatever was happening here, it was happening to me too. The cave wasn't just producing the humming, it was using it as some kind of biological weapon, a frequency that hijacked human consciousness. I stumbled backward toward the tunnel entrance, but my legs felt like they were moving through honey. Each step was a monumental effort, and the humming grew more insistent, more beautiful. Part of my mind whispered that sleeping here wouldn't be so bad. I was tired, so very tired, and these people looked peaceful. They looked free from whatever pain had driven them into the darkness. But another part of my mind, the part that still remembered Sarah's laugh, fought back. She'd battled for every breath in those final weeks, clinging to consciousness even when the morphine tried to pull her under. I couldn't give up now, couldn't let the cave claim me when she'd fought so hard to stay awake. I forced myself to run, crashing through the tunnel like a drunk man, bouncing off walls and stumbling over loose rocks. Behind me, the humming grew angry, discordant, as if the cave knew I was escaping. The temperature began to drop, and the warm, sweet air turned bitter and metallic. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out, stretching endlessly upward through the limestone. My flashlight began to dim. How long had I been underground? and I found myself crawling on hands and knees up the steepest sections. The humming followed me, no longer beautiful but predatory, like the sound a hunting animal makes when it's closing in on wounded prey. When I finally saw daylight filtering down from the cave mouth, I collapsed and sobbed with relief. But as I dragged myself into the afternoon sun, I realized something was wrong with the light. It was too orange, too low on the horizon. I'd entered the cave in the morning, and now the sun was setting. I'd lost an entire day in the darkness. The walk back to the RV was a nightmare of confusion and panic. Nothing looked familiar, and the trails I'd followed that morning seemed to have rearranged themselves. I crashed through underbrush and splashed across streams, following my instincts and praying they would lead me to the campground before full darkness fell. I found the RV just as the last light disappeared from the sky. It sat exactly where I'd left it, surrounded by towering firs, but something felt different. The other campers were gone. Every tent, every car had vanished as if they'd never been there. The campground was completely empty except for my rented Winnebago. Inside the RV, I turned on every light and locked every door. Not that locks would matter if something wanted to get in. I tried my phone again. Still no signal. The radio picked up only static. I was alone in a forest that had somehow erased everyone else while I was underground. I heated a can of soup on the small stove, but my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the spoon. Every sound outside, wind in the trees, branches creaking, the distant call of an owl, made me freeze and listen. The humming was gone, but I could still feel it in my bones, a vibration that had worked its way into my cells and refused to leave. That night, I dreamed of the sleeping people in the cave. But in my dream, they weren't sleeping. They were awake and looking at me with eyes like black holes. They opened their mouths to speak, but instead of words, they produced that terrible, beautiful humming. And I understood, in the way you understand things in dreams, that they were calling me back. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat and still humming along with them. The next morning, I tried to start the RV and leave, but the engine turned over without catching. The battery was strong, the tank was full, but something was preventing the motor from starting. I spent an hour checking connections and fuses, but I knew almost nothing about engines. Eventually, I gave up and decided to hike back to the main road to find help. But when I left the campground on foot, following what should have been the access road, I found myself walking in circles. No matter which direction I chose, I ended up back at the RV within an hour. The forest had become a maze with only one exit, the cave. For 3 days, I tried to escape. I followed the river downstream, reasoning that it had to lead somewhere, but it curved back on itself impossibly. I climbed trees to get my bearings, but the canopy was too thick to see beyond the immediate area. I even tried walking straight in one direction for hours, marking trees as I passed, but I always returned to my starting point with no memory of turning around. On the 4th morning, I woke to find messages carved into the trees around my campsite. The letters were fresh, still weeping sap, and they spelled out single words: remember, choose, deeper, Sarah. That last one hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't mentioned my daughter's name aloud since entering the forest, hadn't even thought it clearly most of the time. But somehow the cave knew. It had been listening not just to my footsteps and my breathing, but to my thoughts, my memories, my grief. I spent that day sitting in the RV's driver's seat, staring at the steering wheel and trying to make sense of what was happening to me. Either I was having a complete psychological breakdown, a possibility I couldn't dismiss, or I'd stumbled into something beyond the reach of rational explanation. Either way, I was trapped, and the cave was calling me back with increasing urgency. The humming returned that night, faint at first but growing stronger with each passing hour. It seemed to come from the ground beneath the RV, as if the cave's influence was spreading through the limestone bedrock. I stuffed cotton balls in my ears, but the sound bypassed my eardrums entirely, resonating in my skull like a tuning fork struck against bone. By morning, I could barely think coherently. The humming had become a constant presence, drowning out my internal monologue and replacing it with wordless music. I found myself humming along without conscious decision, my throat vibrating in harmony with frequencies that seemed to originate in my chest cavity. I knew I had to make a choice. Fight the cave's influence until it drove me completely insane, or surrender and join the sleepers in the crystalline chamber. Part of me welcomed the second option. Sarah was gone, Jennifer was gone, and I had no life worth preserving in the outside world. The cave offered peace, eternal rest, freedom from the guilt and loss that had been eating me alive for months. But as I sat there humming along with the cave's song, I remembered something Sarah had said during one of her lucid moments near the end. She'd grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked directly into my eyes. "Don't you dare give up, Daddy. Promise me you won't give up." I'd promised then, and the promise still held. I forced myself to stand, to move, to fight against the growing lethargy in my limbs. The cave wanted me compliant, dreaming, lost in whatever fantasy it provided to keep its victims calm, but I wasn't going down without a fight. In the RV's small bathroom, I found a bottle of No-Dose and dry-swallowed 4 tablets. Then I opened the propane tanks and turned on every burner on the stove without lighting them. If the cave wanted me, it could have me, along with an explosion that might collapse part of the limestone structure. The gas smell filled the RV quickly, and the humming grew frantic, discordant. Something was banging against the walls outside, and the entire vehicle rocked as if a bear were trying to break in. But I knew it wasn't a bear. It was the cave itself, manifesting physically to stop me from destroying what it had built. I lit a match. The explosion threw me backward against the rear wall of the RV, and then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital in Port Angeles, connected to an IV and surrounded by the antiseptic smell of medical equipment. A nurse told me I'd been found by park rangers 3 miles from the Sol Duke campground, unconscious and suffering from severe dehydration and exposure. There was no sign of an RV, no record of me having rented one, and no evidence of any explosion. The doctor who examined me was kind but skeptical. He suggested that I'd suffered a psychological break following my daughter's death, that the entire experience had been an elaborate hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. He recommended therapy, medication, and close supervision by family members. Jennifer came to pick me up, though we barely spoke during the drive home. She looked at me the way you look at a stranger, someone you used to know but can no longer recognize. I didn't blame her. I could see myself in the passenger side mirror, and my eyes had the flat, empty quality of someone who'd seen too much. That was 6 months ago. I've been in therapy since then, taking antidepressants and sleeping pills and talking twice a week to a psychiatrist who nods sympathetically while I describe my episode in the forest. Everyone wants me to accept that it was all in my head, a grief-induced break from reality that manifested as an elaborate fantasy. But I know what I experienced was real, because I can still hear the humming. It's faint now, barely noticeable unless I'm in complete silence, but it's always there. A low, constant vibration that resonates in my bones. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself humming along without realizing it, and in those moments, I can feel the cave calling me back, patient and eternal, waiting for me to stop fighting and accept what it offered. I've researched the area extensively, poring over geological surveys and cave systems in Olympic National Forest. There are dozens of limestone formations in the region, many of them unexplored. Park records show a pattern of missing hikers going back decades, people who vanished without a trace in that particular section of forest. The official explanation is that the terrain is dangerous, full of hidden crevasses and unstable rock formations. But I know the truth. The cave is still there, still humming, still calling to anyone who gets close enough to hear it. And somewhere in its crystalline depths, those sleepers are still dreaming, breathing in perfect rhythm with frequencies that predate human consciousness. Last week, I found myself looking at rental RV websites, planning another trip to Washington. I told myself it was just curiosity, just a need to prove to myself that I could return to the scene of my breakdown and emerge intact. But as I scrolled through listings and read about forest access roads, I could feel the humming growing stronger, more insistent. The cave is patient. It knows I'll come back eventually. The grief that drove me there the first time hasn't gone away. It's just learned to hide beneath medication and therapy and the careful performance of normal life. But it's still there, a constant ache that nothing can heal except perhaps the eternal sleep the cave offers. Jennifer has filed for divorce again. The papers are sitting on my kitchen table, waiting for my signature. She says she can't live with who I've become, that I'm not the man she married. She's right, of course. That man died in the cave with the rest of my former life. Sometimes I wonder about the other sleepers, whether they had families who mourned them, whether they tried to resist the cave's call before finally surrendering. I picture them down there in the darkness, dreaming dreams that feel more real than the waking world, breathing in harmony with something ancient and patient and utterly alien. The humming is getting louder now, even as I write this. My hands are shaking, and I can feel my breathing starting to synchronize with that remembered rhythm. The no-dose isn't working anymore, and the sleeping pills make the dreams more vivid, more appealing. I know I'm going back. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but eventually. The cave has marked me, claimed me, and all the therapy in the world can't change that. It's patient because it knows it doesn't need to rush. Grief has its own timeline, and mine is leading inexorably back to that limestone opening in the forest where the earth itself sings lullabies to broken people. When I go, I won't fight it this time. I'll follow the humming down into the crystalline chamber and find an empty sleeping bag among the others. I'll zip myself inside and close my eyes and let the cave's song wash over me like warm water. And maybe, in whatever dreams the cave provides, I'll see Sarah again. Maybe she'll be 6 years old and healthy, blowing out birthday candles that never burn down. Maybe that's worth more than the waking world could ever offer. The humming is beautiful now, layered with harmonies that speak directly to the parts of me that remember love and loss and the weight of being human. It's calling my name, not Marcus, but something deeper, something true that even I don't know yet. I'm almost ready to answer. Story 4. My name is Marcus. I'm 34, and I carved my initials at Dolly Sod's Wilderness, West Virginia, and the tree spelled them better. That should have been my first warning, but I was too caught up in the excitement of finally getting away from everything to notice how the bark had somehow rearranged itself into perfect letters. Cleaner, deeper, more deliberate than anything my old camping knife could have managed. I'd driven the RV up from Richmond 3 days earlier, desperate to escape the suffocating aftermath of my divorce. Sarah had taken the house, the car, and most of our friends in the settlement, leaving me with a beat-up Winnebago I'd bought impulsively from a Craigslist ad and a burning need to prove I could survive on my own. Dolly Sod seemed perfect, remote enough that I wouldn't run into weekend warriors, but accessible enough that my ancient RV could handle the Forest Service roads. The wilderness area sprawled across the Allegheny Mountains like a scar on the earth, all windswept plateaus and twisted trees shaped by centuries of brutal weather. Red Creek Campground was mostly empty when I arrived, just me and an elderly couple from Pennsylvania who kept to themselves. I'd chosen a spot at the far end, where the campground dissolved into wilderness and the sound of other people couldn't reach me. That first night, I'd felt genuinely peaceful for the first time in months. I'd built a fire, opened a beer, and watched the stars emerge over the plateau. The silence was complete. No traffic, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no lawyers calling about paperwork, just the whisper of wind through the stunted spruce trees and the occasional pop from the fire. It was on the second day that I decided to explore beyond the established trails. The main paths were well marked and maintained, but I wanted something more challenging, more solitary. I'd spotted what looked like an old logging road on my topographic map, branching off from the Dobbin Grade Trail and heading deeper into the wilderness. According to the map, it dead-ended at what was marked only as Survey Boundary. I set out early while mist still clung to the valleys between the ridges. The morning air bit at my face, sharp with the promise of winter, though it was only late October. The established trail was easy-going at first, a wide path cut through stands of red spruce and hemlock. But when I found the junction where the old logging road branched off, everything changed. The road wasn't on any official trail map. Hell, it barely qualified as a road anymore. Just two parallel ruts overgrown with ferns and mountain laurel, so faint I might have missed them if not for the old metal blazes nailed to trees every few hundred yards. The blazes were rusty and weathered, marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Not the standard geometric shapes used by the Forest Service, but crude scratches that looked almost like letters from an alphabet I'd never seen. I followed the road for what felt like hours, though my watch insisted only 40 minutes had passed. The forest grew thicker and darker as I climbed, the canopy closing overhead until only fragments of sky showed through. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I found myself walking through pockets of fog that seemed to have no source. That's when I saw the fence. It appeared without warning, emerging from the mist like something from a nightmare. A chain-link barrier at least 12 feet high, topped with 3 rows of razor wire that gleamed dully in the filtered light. The fence stretched away in both directions, disappearing into the trees, following the contours of the ridge with mechanical precision. But there was no gate, no entrance of any kind. I walked along the fence line for nearly an hour, first in one direction, then the other. It formed a perfect circle, or as close to perfect as the terrain would allow. The perimeter had to be at least 2 miles around, enclosing hundreds of acres of dense forest. But there was no way in. No gate, no gap, no break in the wire. The fence posts were sunk deep into concrete footings that looked decades old, covered with lichen and rust stains. Most disturbing of all, there were no signs. No warnings about private property or government land. No explanations of what was being kept in or out. Inside the fence, the forest looked different. The trees were taller, older, with trunks that seemed to twist as they rose toward the canopy. The undergrowth was sparse, almost manicured, as if something had been carefully clearing away the smaller plants and fallen branches. And it was absolutely silent. Not the normal forest quiet where you could still hear birds and insects and the rustle of small animals, but a complete absence of sound that made my ears ring. I pressed my face against the chain link, trying to see deeper into the enclosed area. The fence was just transparent enough to be maddening. I could make out shapes and movement in the distance, but never clearly enough to identify what I was looking at. Shadows that moved too deliberately to be cast by swaying branches. Patches of darkness that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. My hands were still gripping the fence when I heard the humming. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing. A vibration I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. But it grew stronger, taking on an almost mechanical rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not from inside the fence, but from the fence itself, as if the metal were conducting some kind of signal. I jerked my hands away and the humming stopped instantly. I stood there for several minutes, breathing hard, waiting for it to start again. But the silence had returned, even deeper than before. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, absorbed by the strange quality of the air around the fence. I took pictures with my phone, though I wasn't sure why. The images came out strangely distorted, the fence appearing to shimmer and bend even though it was perfectly straight in person. When I tried to check my GPS location, the app showed nothing but a blank screen with a slowly spinning loading icon. The walk back to the campground felt longer than it should have. The old logging road seemed to twist and branch in ways I didn't remember, and twice I found myself at what looked like dead ends before spotting the faded blazes marking the correct path. By the time I reached the main trail, the sun was already setting behind the ridges, painting the sky the color of rust and blood. Back at the RV, I spread out my topographic maps and tried to locate the fence. According to the coordinates I'd written down before my GPS failed, it should have been right there on the map. But the area showed nothing but contour lines and forest symbols. No structures, no boundaries, no indication that anything man-made existed in that part of the wilderness. I called the ranger station from my cell phone, catching the last bar of signal from the campground. Dolly Sod's ranger station, this is Jim. Hi, I'm camping at Red Creek, and I had a question about some infrastructure I found while hiking today. There's a large fenced area off the old logging road from Dobbin Grade Trail. Sorry, what road? I described the location as best I could, but the ranger sounded confused. He'd been working in the area for 15 years, he said, and knew every trail and old road in the wilderness. There was no logging road branching off from Dobbin Grade, and definitely no fenced areas. The entire region was designated wilderness. No permanent structures allowed. "You sure you didn't wander onto private land somehow?" he asked. "Maybe got turned around?" But I'd been careful with my navigation. I'd followed the blazes, stayed on what was clearly an established route. And private land would have been marked on my maps, posted with signs. After I hung up, I sat in the RV's dinette and stared at the maps until my eyes burned. The fence was real. I had pictures, though they were strangely blurred. I had GPS coordinates, even if the device wouldn't work near the site. I had the memory of that bone-deep humming and the sight of shapes moving in the shadows beyond the chain link. But, according to every official source, it didn't exist. I barely slept that night. Every time I dozed off, I found myself dreaming of the fence. But in the dreams, it was moving, creeping closer to the campground like a slow tide. I'd wake with the taste of metal in my mouth and the echo of that mechanical humming in my ears. The next morning, I decided to go back. I told myself I needed to document it properly, to gather evidence that something was there. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen moving in the shadows. The rational part of my mind insisted it had been nothing. Tricks of light, wind-blown branches, the natural paranoia that comes from being alone in deep wilderness. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it hadn't been natural. This time I brought my digital camera with the telephoto lens, extra batteries, and a handheld GPS unit I'd bought years earlier for backcountry hunting. If the fence was somehow jamming modern electronics, maybe the older device would work. The logging road was easier to find on the second trip, as if my feet remembered the route even when my mind wasn't sure. But something felt different as I walked. The forest seemed more alert, more watchful. Birds fell silent as I passed, and I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I turned to look. The old GPS unit worked perfectly until I got within about a quarter mile of the fence. Then it started behaving erratically, showing impossible locations, claiming I was simultaneously in West Virginia, Alaska, and the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Finally, it simply shut off, the screen going dark despite showing full battery power just minutes before. When I reached the fence, my heart nearly stopped. There was a gate, a perfectly ordinary chain-link gate with a simple latch, set into the fence as if it had always been there. It even had hinges that looked freshly oiled, gleaming silver against the rust-stained posts. But I'd walked this entire perimeter the day before. I'd checked every inch of the fence line, looking specifically for an entrance. The gate hadn't been there. I stood in front of it for a long time, my hands shaking as I raised the camera. Through the viewfinder, the gate flickered in and out of existence. One moment it was there, solid and real. The next, the fence stretched unbroken, seamless. But when I lowered the camera, the gate remained. The latch was simple, just a sliding bolt that moved easily when I touched it. Too easily. It should have been seized with rust after years of weather, but it slid like it had been installed yesterday. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, hike back to the campground, pack up the RV, and drive as far away as possible. But curiosity has always been my weakness. In school, I'd been the kid who poked at wasps' nests and lifted rocks to see what was underneath. My ex-wife used to say it would get me killed someday. Maybe she was right. I opened the gate and stepped through. The change was immediate and overwhelming. The air inside the fence was warmer, thick and humid like a greenhouse. The silence was so complete it felt solid, pressing against my eardrums. And the smell, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. The forest here was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. The trees were too straight, too evenly spaced, their trunks rising like pillars in a cathedral. The undergrowth had been cleared away entirely, leaving only bare earth carpeted with a thick layer of dead leaves that rustled too loudly under my feet. But it was the paths that made my skin crawl. They radiated out from the gate like spokes on a wheel, each one arrow straight and exactly the same width. They were worn into the earth as if thousands of feet had walked them, but the wear patterns were too uniform, too geometric. No natural path ever looked like that. I chose the one that led directly away from the gate and started walking. The path descended gradually into a shallow valley, following what might once have been a creek bed. But there was no water now, just smooth stones arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The trees pressed closer on either side, their branches intertwining overhead to form a tunnel of green shadows. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I reached the center. It was a perfect circle, perhaps 50 yards across, completely bare of vegetation. The earth here was packed hard as concrete, worn smooth by countless footsteps. In the exact center stood a single tree, massive and ancient, its trunk easily 8 feet in diameter. But it was dead, had been dead for a very long time. The bark had fallen away in places, revealing wood so dark it was almost black. Carved into that dark wood, spiraling up the trunk from ground level to the lowest branches, were symbols. Not the crude scratches I'd seen on the trailblazes, but intricate designs that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. They reminded me of the fence itself, geometric patterns that suggested meaning without revealing it. And hanging from the branches were things I initially mistook for leaves. They were photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, suspended from fishing line and turning slowly in the thick air. Black and white snapshots, Polaroids, digital prints, even what looked like old daguerreotypes. Most showed people, individuals, couples, families, all taken in what appeared to be wilderness settings, camping trips, hiking expeditions, hunting parties. I moved closer, raising my camera to capture the bizarre sight. That's when I noticed that many of the photos showed the same locations I recognized from my own camping trips. Devil's Tower in Wyoming, where I'd celebrated my 30th birthday. The Grand Canyon's North Rim, where Sarah and I had honeymooned. Even Dolly Sods itself, showing the exact campsite where my RV was parked. But in each photo, there were more people than there should have been. Extra figures standing just outside the frame's natural boundaries. Shadow shapes that seemed to move between the trees. And in every single image, without exception, there was at least one person who appeared to be looking directly at the camera with an expression of absolute terror. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the camera steady. I backed away from the tree, my heart hammering against my ribs. The photos continued to turn in their invisible breeze, and I caught glimpses of faces I thought I recognized. A ranger from Yellowstone who'd helped me with a permit 5 years ago. A fellow camper I'd met briefly at Lake Tahoe. People from half-remembered encounters in a dozen different wilderness areas. And then I saw myself. It was a photo from my first day at Dolly Sods, showing me standing beside my RV with the sunset painting the sky behind me. I remembered taking a selfie in that exact spot, but this wasn't my photo. The angle was wrong, taken from somewhere in the trees beyond the campground, and standing just behind me, so faint it was almost transparent, was a figure I definitely hadn't seen when I took the picture. A tall, impossibly thin shape that seemed to be reaching toward my shoulder. I ran. I don't remember making the decision to flee. One moment I was staring at my own face in that impossible photograph. The next I was crashing through the underbrush, abandoning the geometric paths in favor of a straight line toward where I hoped the fence would be. But the fence had moved. I ran for what felt like hours, always expecting to see chain link through the trees ahead. But it never appeared. The forest stretched on endlessly, the same cathedral-like arrangement of 2 straight trees and bare earth. The paths kept appearing beneath my feet no matter which direction I ran, all of them leading back toward that central clearing and its terrible tree. Finally, exhausted and hyperventilating, I stopped and tried to think rationally. I was lost, but not truly lost. The fence formed a circle, which meant I could navigate by simply walking in one direction until I hit the perimeter. Then I could follow it around until I found the gate. But when I tried to establish a bearing using the sun, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't see it. The canopy overhead was too thick, and the light that filtered through was directionless and gray. Even more disturbing, my watch had stopped. The digital display showed 12 psiu, blinking steadily, though it had been working perfectly when I entered the enclosure. I picked a direction at random and started walking, trying to maintain a straight line, but the paths kept interfering, appearing under my feet like magnetic currents drawing me back toward the center. Every time I tried to step off them, the undergrowth became impossibly thick. Thorny vines and fallen logs that seemed to materialize from nowhere. After an hour of futile struggle, I gave up and followed one of the paths. Maybe it would eventually lead to another gate, or at least to the fence itself. Instead, it led to more clearings. They were scattered throughout the enclosed forest like beads on a string, each one identical to the first. The same bare earth, the same ancient dead tree, the same spiraling symbols carved into black wood. But the photographs were different in each clearing, showing different locations, different time periods. In the second clearing, the photos were older, sepia-toned images of Victorian-era camping expeditions, men in wool suits standing beside canvas tents. But they all had the same quality as the modern pictures: extra figures lurking at the edges, shadow shapes that didn't belong. The third clearing held photos that were older still, faded daguerreotypes showing wagon trains and frontier settlements. The quality was poor, but I could still make out those familiar extra figures, standing just beyond the reach of the primitive cameras. And in the fourth clearing, I found photos I was certain couldn't exist. They appeared to be Civil War era, showing Union soldiers camped in a forest that looked exactly like the one around me. But the perspectives were wrong. The cameras that took these pictures would have had to be mounted impossibly high, looking down on the soldiers from the treetops. And in every image there were shadows moving among the men, dark shapes that seemed to be herding them into formation. I was examining one particularly disturbing photograph when I heard the rustling behind me. I turned to find that the photos in the first clearing had followed me. They hung from the branches of this tree too now, turning slowly in the thick air. But they'd changed. The modern photos now showed empty campsites, abandoned RVs, hiking gear scattered along trails with no sign of their owners. And in my own photo, the one taken outside my RV, the shadowy figure behind me was clearer now, more solid. It had my face. I backed away from the tree, my throat so tight I could barely breathe. The photos continued to multiply, spreading from branch to branch like some kind of infection. New images appeared even as I watched. Security camera footage from gas stations, traffic cameras from highway intersections, surveillance photos from airports and border crossings. All of them showing me at various points in my life, but with that extra figure always lurking nearby. Sometimes it was barely visible, just a distortion in the background. Other times it was clear enough to see details. The same clothes I was wearing, the same face, but with expressions I'd never made. Smiles too wide, eyes too bright, expressions of hunger and predatory satisfaction. And in the most recent photos, the ones that must have been taken in the last few days, the figure wasn't hiding anymore. It stood beside me in full view, an exact duplicate except for those horrible expressions. In some images, it appeared to be reaching for me. In others, it was gesturing to things outside the frame, as if directing an unseen audience. The rustling sound was getting louder, coming from all directions now. I looked around wildly and realized that every tree in the forest was covered with hanging photographs. They filled the canopy like obscene fruit, thousands upon thousands of images swaying in the humid air. And they were all looking at me, not the people in the photos. They still stared out with their expressions of terror and confusion. But the extra figures, the shadow shapes, the duplicates and distortions, they had all turned toward me, their faces swiveling to track my movement as I stumbled backward through the clearing. I ran again, crashing through the forest without any regard for direction. The paths tried to guide me, but I fought against them, forcing my way through gaps in the undergrowth that seemed to close behind me as I passed. Thorns tore at my clothes and skin, but I barely felt them. All I could think about was getting away from those watching eyes, from the thousands of photographs that chronicled a lifetime of being stalked by something wearing my own face. It was almost dark when I finally saw the fence. I burst out of the tree line and stumbled into the chain link with enough force to rattle the entire structure. The metal was real and solid under my hands, and I could have wept with relief. I was getting out. I was going to escape this place and never look back. But the gate was gone. I ran along the fence line in both directions, retracing my steps from the previous day. But there was no break in the barrier, no sign that a gate had ever existed. The fence was seamless, unbroken, exactly as I'd first found it. I pressed my face against the chain link and screamed for help, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the strange air inside the enclosure. Even I could barely hear myself, and I knew the sound would never carry beyond the fence. I tried to climb, but the razor wire at the top was too well positioned. Every time I made it more than a few feet up, the wire would slice through my clothes and skin, forcing me to drop back down. After an hour of attempts, my hands were shredded and my shirt was soaked with blood. Finally, I sat with my back against the fence and tried to think. There had to be a way out. The gate had been real. I'd photographed it, walked through it, which meant it could appear again. But as night fell inside the enclosure, I began to understand that I might be trapped until whoever or whatever controlled this place decided to let me go. If they decided to let me go. The darkness here was different from normal forest darkness. It was absolute, complete, as if the canopy absorbed every photon of starlight and moonlight before it could reach the ground. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, couldn't even be certain my eyes were open. But I could hear movement. Footsteps on the geometric paths, multiple sets of them, all moving with the same measured pace. They seemed to be converging on my position, approaching from every direction at once. I pressed harder against the fence, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps stopped just outside my field of vision, which, in the absolute darkness, meant they could have been anywhere from 3 feet to 30 feet away. Then someone spoke. "Hello, Marcus." The voice was mine, exactly mine, down to the slight hoarseness I'd developed from years of smoking in college. But the tone was wrong, too cheerful, too bright, like someone doing an impersonation of happiness. "I've been waiting for you," the voice continued. "We all have." "We?" My own voice came out as a croak. "Oh yes, there are so many of us now. Every time someone finds this place, there's one more. We've been collecting for a very long time." I heard movement in the darkness, the sound of multiple people shifting position. But their movements were too synchronized, too coordinated, like a single entity wearing multiple bodies. "What do you want?" I whispered. "Want?" The voice that sounded like mine laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. "We don't want anything. We're just here to help you understand." Understand what? That you were never alone out there. That everywhere you went, every trail you hiked, every campsite you chose, we were already there, waiting, watching, learning. More movement in the darkness, and I caught a whiff of something that smelled like decay and old photographs. The fence isn't a prison, Marcus. It's a darkroom, a place where images develop, where the shadows you've been carrying finally become real. I tried to stand, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the darkness itself was holding me in place. "You've seen the photographs," the voice continued. "All those extra figures, all those shapes in the background. Did you think they were accidents? Random artifacts of light and shadow? What are you? We're you, Marcus. All the versions of you that might have been, should have been, could still be. The you that smiled at that family in Yellowstone instead of walking past. The you that helped that lost hiker in Colorado instead of pretending not to see him. The you that stayed with Sarah instead of running away when things got difficult." The voice moved closer, and I felt breath against my ear. My own breath, warm and moist. "Were all the choices you didn't make, all the kindness you withheld, all the connections you severed. And we've been growing stronger every time you chose isolation over community, every time you picked solitude over responsibility." I managed to find my voice. "That's not true. I'm not a bad person. I just needed space." "Space." The voice laughed again. "Yes, you've always needed space. Space from your wife, space from your friends, Space from anyone who might have expected something from you. Well, Marcus, you finally found all the space you could ever want. The darkness around me rustled, and I realized it wasn't empty. It was full of shapes, dozens of them, all moving with that same synchronized motion, and they were all me. I could sense it somehow, feel the terrible familiarity of their presence. "The gate will open again," the voice said, "when you're ready, when you understand what you really are, what you've always been." When will that be? When you stop trying to leave. The footsteps began to move away, the coordinated march fading into the distance. But I could still feel them out there, circling the fence, patient and endless. I don't know how long I sat there. Time moved strangely in the absolute darkness, and my watch remained frozen at 12D. It could have been hours or days. Eventually, I must have slept, though I didn't remember dreaming. When gray light finally began to filter through the canopy, I opened my eyes to find myself in a different place entirely. I was sitting in the central clearing, my back against the massive dead tree. The photographs still hung from its branches, but they'd changed again during the night. Now they showed only me. Hundreds of images spanning my entire life, from childhood camping trips with my parents to the previous day's arrival at Dolly Sod's. But in every single photo, I was alone. The other people had been edited out somehow, their presence erased as cleanly as if they'd never existed. My parents, gone from our family camping trips. Sarah, absent from our wedding photos and honeymoon pictures. Friends and fellow hikers and passing strangers, all removed, leaving me as the sole figure in frame after frame of empty wilderness. And in the center of the tree, carved deeper than all the other symbols, were two words: "Found you." I stood up slowly, my joints stiff from sleeping against the tree. The clearing looked different in the daylight, smaller, more confined. The paths radiating outward seemed to have multiplied, creating a complex web of roots that hurt to look at directly. I chose one at random and began walking. This time, the path led directly to the fence, and the gate was there, standing open, exactly as I'd left it the day before. I approached it cautiously, expecting it to vanish or transform, but it remained solid and real, the latch gleaming in the morning light. Beyond it, I could see the familiar forest of Dolly Sods, normal trees with normal spacing, and the distant sound of wind through the mountains. I hesitated at the threshold. Something felt wrong about leaving, though I couldn't articulate what. It was as if I was forgetting something important, leaving behind some crucial part of myself, but I stepped through anyway. The change was immediate. The oppressive humidity vanished, replaced by crisp mountain air. The unnatural silence gave way to normal forest sounds: birds calling, insects humming, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. My watch started running again, showing 6:47 a.m. I walked quickly back toward the main trail, not allowing myself to look back, but I could feel something behind me, following at a distance. Not malevolent exactly, but persistent, patient. When I reached the campground, my RV was exactly as I'd left it. But as I approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were two sets of footprints in the dust around the vehicle. Mine, and an identical set that seemed to parallel my movements perfectly. The second set was slightly deeper, as if made by someone carrying extra weight. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking as I unlocked the RV door. Inside, everything appeared normal. My clothes were still scattered across the bed, my maps spread on the dinette table. But there was a new smell, that same sweet, cloying odor I'd encountered inside the fence. And on the table, spread among my topographic maps, were photographs. The same photos from the tree, showing my life edited of all human contact. But these were originals, not the faded copies I'd seen hanging from the branches. They were crisp and clear, with photographer's stamps on the back dating them to the exact moments they'd been taken. Under them was a note, written in my own handwriting. "Thanks for letting me out. I'll take good care of things while you're gone. M." I grabbed the note, my hands shaking. The handwriting was perfect, identical to my own, down to the slight forward slant and the way I dotted my I's. but I hadn't written it. I was certain I hadn't written it. I ran outside and checked the footprints again. The deeper set led away from the RV, heading toward the road. They were fresh, made within the last few hours. Something wearing my face and my voice had been here, had been inside my RV, going through my things, perhaps trying them on like clothes. And now it was out there, walking around in a world that would never question its presence, because it was me, indistinguishable from me in every way except for whatever lay behind its eyes. I packed, frantically, throwing clothes and equipment into bags without bothering to organize them. All I wanted was to get away from Dolly Sods, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I'd released from that fenced enclosure. But as I drove down the mountain, I kept catching glimpses of myself in the rearview mirror. Not my reflection. That was normal, showing my haggard face and bloodshot eyes. But in the trees beside the road, walking parallel to my route, I could see a figure that looked exactly like me. It waved when it noticed me watching. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm writing this in a motel room in Ohio, as far from West Virginia as I could drive in a day. I've been moving constantly since leaving Dolly Sods, never staying in one place for more than a night or two. But it doesn't matter where I go. The other me is always there, just at the edge of my vision. I see it in security cameras at gas stations, reflected in store windows, standing in crowds of strangers. It's living my life better than I ever did. I've watched it help stranded motorists, chat easily with convenience store clerks, smile at children in ways that come naturally to it, but never did to me. People like it better than they ever liked me. I can see it in their faces when they interact with it. It's everything I could have been if I'd made different choices, been a different person. And I'm starting to understand that the fence wasn't meant to keep something in. It was meant to keep something out. The real horror isn't what I found in that enclosure. It's what I became by choosing, again and again, to walk away from human connection. The fence was just a mirror, showing me what I'd turned myself into through years of calculated isolation, and what had been growing in the spaces I left behind. My phone rang yesterday. The caller ID showed my own number. "Hello, Marcus," the voice said. It was mine, but warmer, more confident. "How are you holding up? What do you want?" "I wanted to thank you, and to let you know that Sarah called. She's been worried about you. I had such a nice long talk with her." My blood went cold. "You stay away from her. Why would I do that? She's my wife too, remember? And I'm so much better at being married than you were. We're meeting for coffee tomorrow. She's thinking about giving us another chance." The line went dead. I'm driving back to Virginia tonight. Not because I think I can stop what's happening, but because I need to see it for myself. I need to watch as the version of me that I could have been reclaims the life I threw away. The fence is still there in the mountains of West Virginia, I'm sure. Still collecting shadows, still developing images in its darkroom wilderness. And somewhere inside it, there's probably a new tree growing, with new photographs hanging from its branches. Pictures of someone else who thought they could run away from themselves. Someone else who learned too late that the things we abandon don't simply disappear. They wait. And they get better at being us than we ever were. Story 5. My name is Marcus. I'm 34, and I tightened the guy lines at Sequoia National Forest to keep the night out. The irony wasn't lost on me, trying to secure our campsite when everything else in my life had come undone. Sarah sat in our rented RV, staring at her phone even though we both knew there was no signal this deep in the Kauai River Canyon. We'd driven 8 hours from Sacramento to find silence, to patch up what 18 months of marriage counseling couldn't fix, but the quiet between us felt heavier than the towering sequoias surrounding our campsite. "The fire's getting low," Sarah called through the RV's screen door, her voice carrying that careful neutrality we'd perfected, the tone that said everything and nothing. I looked at the campfire I'd built an hour ago. She was right. The flames had dwindled to glowing embers, barely casting light beyond the circle of stones. Strange, though. I'd stacked enough dry pine to burn for hours, and the wood had looked seasoned, perfect for a long burn. But fires were unpredictable, like everything else lately. "I'll get more wood," I said, grabbing the small hatchet from beside our camp chairs. The forest pressed close around our site, dense with sugar pines and giant sequoias that vanished into darkness above. Our RV sat in a small clearing beside the Kauai, the river's constant murmur masking smaller sounds, the crack of cooling metal, the rustle of something moving through dry leaves. I'd chosen this spot specifically because it was isolated. No other campers for miles, no cell towers, no distractions, just us and whatever was left of us to salvage. The nearest ranger station was a 20-minute drive back toward the main road, and I'd seen maybe 3 other vehicles since we'd turned off the highway onto this forgotten access road. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness as I searched for deadfall. Sequoia National Forest was full of it, massive trees that had stood for centuries before drought or wind finally claimed them. But as I walked further from our camp, dragging my light across the forest floor, something felt off. The usual sounds were wrong. No owls hooting, no small animals scurrying through underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted, their evening chorus reduced to an occasional chirp. I found a decent-sized branch about 50 yards from camp and started chopping it into manageable pieces. The hatchet bit into the wood with sharp cracks that echoed strangely in the still air. 3 swings, 4, 5, and then I heard Sarah scream. The hatchet slipped from my hands as I spun toward our campsite. Through the trees, I could see the RV's exterior lights still glowing, but something was wrong with the fire. It was burning again. Not just burning, but roaring. Flames reached 6 feet high, crackling and spitting sparks that should have been impossible with the few embers I'd left. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, my flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of me. When I burst into the clearing, Sarah was standing beside the RV's door, her face pale in the firelight. "I didn't add anything," she said before I could ask. I was inside, and I heard this whooshing sound, like someone had thrown gasoline on it. When I came out, it was like this. The fire burned with an intensity that made no sense. The same logs I'd left as dying embers now blazed like fresh kindling, but there was something else. The flames flickered with colors that weren't quite right. Blues and greens mixed with the orange and yellow, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Maybe there was some sap or something in the wood," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded hollow. "Pine resin can burn pretty hot." Sarah nodded, but I could see she wasn't buying it either. We both stared at the fire, mesmerized by its unnatural vigor. The heat was intense enough that we had to move our camp chairs back several feet, and the light cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. "We should probably let it burn down before bed," I said. "Don't want to risk sparks with all this dry brush around." But the fire didn't burn down. An hour later, as we sat in uncomfortable silence, it was still roaring with the same impossible intensity. I'd stopped feeding it wood 30 minutes ago, yet the flames showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, they seemed to be growing stronger. "This is weird, Marcus." Sarah's voice was tight with an anxiety I hadn't heard since her panic attacks 2 years ago. "Fires don't work like this." I wanted to argue, to provide some rational explanation that would calm her down and restore the illusion that I had control over something, anything in our lives. But I was watching the same impossible flames, feeling the same creeping unease that made my skin crawl. "Maybe we should just go inside," I suggested. "Let it burn itself out." But inside the RV, we could still see the fire through the windows. The orange glow painted everything in shifting light, and the crackling sound seemed to follow us through the thin walls. Sarah climbed into the dinette booth and pulled her knees to her chest, a position I remembered from our worst fights. "I don't like this place," she whispered. "Something feels wrong." I wanted to comfort her, to play the role of the confident husband who could handle any crisis. But as I looked out at the fire that refused to obey the basic laws of combustion, I felt the same wrongness she did. It was like a frequency just below hearing, a vibration in my bones that said we shouldn't be here. "We'll leave in the morning," I said, "if you want." She nodded gratefully, and for a moment, I thought this might actually bring us closer together, shared fear accomplishing what months of therapy couldn't. But when I reached for her hand, she pulled away, lost in her own thoughts. I lay awake most of that night, listening to the fire's relentless crackling through the RV's thin walls. Every time I drifted toward sleep, some sound would jolt me awake. A pop that was too sharp, a hiss that lasted too long, or, worst of all, what sounded like whispers mixed in with the flame's voice. Sarah eventually fell asleep around 2 a.m., but her breathing was quick and shallow, punctuated by small sounds of distress. When dawn finally came, I stumbled outside expecting to find a pile of cold ash. Instead, the fire was still burning. Not just burning, raging with the same impossible intensity as the night before. 12 hours of continuous flame without a single piece of fresh fuel, and the logs looked exactly the same as when I'd first lit them. No char, no consumption, just endless burning. I stood there in my boxer shorts and t-shirt, feeling the morning chill on my back and the fire's heat on my face, trying to process what I was seeing. The logical part of my brain offered explanations. Maybe there was a gas leak underground or some kind of chemical deposit that was feeding the flames. But those explanations felt thin as tissue paper. Sarah emerged from the RV, already dressed and clearly agitated. "It's still going. I can see that. Marcus, this isn't normal. We need to leave. Right now." I wanted to agree, but something stubborn in me rebelled against being driven away by something I couldn't understand. Maybe it was male pride. Or maybe it was just the same pig-headedness that had kept me pushing for this trip when Sarah clearly hadn't wanted to come. Either way, I found myself shaking my head. Let me try to put it out first. If there's some kind of chemical thing happening, we shouldn't just leave it burning. Could start a forest fire. Sarah stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "You want to try to put out a fire that's been burning for 12 hours without fuel? I want to understand what's happening. Sometimes there isn't an explanation, Marcus. Sometimes you just have to accept that something is wrong and walk away." The words hit harder than she'd intended, carrying weight beyond our current situation. This was the same argument we'd been having for months. My need to analyze and fix everything versus her growing conviction that some things were simply broken beyond repair. I walked to the river and filled our largest pot with water. The Kaweah ran fast and cold here, fed by snowmelt from the high Sierra. When I threw the water on the fire, it hissed and steamed dramatically, but the flames didn't diminish. If anything, they seemed to surge higher, as if the water had somehow fed them. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, filling the pot again. 3 more trips to the river, 3 more futile dousings. The fire consumed the water without being consumed itself, creating great clouds of steam that smelled wrong. Not like wood smoke and water vapor, but something else. Something organic and rotten underneath. Sarah watched from beside the RV, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Are you satisfied now?" I wasn't satisfied. I was terrified. But I couldn't admit that to her. Not when she was already looking at me like I was a stranger. Like the man she'd married had been replaced by someone too stubborn to recognize obvious danger. 5 more minutes, I said. "Let me try sand." The riverbank provided plenty of fine sand and small gravel. I filled our cooking pot and threw handfuls at the base of the fire, trying to smother it. The sand fell through the flames like they weren't there, settling on the ground beneath without affecting the burning wood above. It was as if the fire existed in a slightly different space, occupying the same area but not quite touching our reality. That's when I noticed the smell had changed again. The rotten undertone was stronger now, mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the basement in my childhood home after the sewage backup. Sweet and foul and wrong. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice was sharp with fear. "Look at the wood." I looked. The logs I'd been staring at for the past 10 minutes were different. They were still the same pieces of pine deadfall I'd gathered yesterday, but now they had patterns burned into them. Not random char marks, but deliberate symbols, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, like optical illusions that made my eyes water. "We're leaving," Sarah said, and this time it wasn't a suggestion. I wanted to argue, but the symbols on the burning wood seemed to be moving, shifting and flowing like living things. My rational mind supplied explanations, heat mirages, tired eyes, stress-induced hallucinations, but my gut told me to listen to my wife. "Okay," I said. "Okay, let's pack up." We threw our stuff into the RV with the desperate efficiency of people fleeing a natural disaster. Clothes got stuffed into bags without folding, dishes went unwashed into cabinets, everything else got crammed into whatever space would hold it. Through it all, the fire continued its impossible burning, casting shadows that seemed to reach for us as we worked. I was disconnecting the electrical hookups when I realized the shadows were wrong. The fire was behind me, so my shadow should have been falling in front of the RV. But when I looked down, my shadow was angled toward the flames, as if the light was coming from the opposite direction. When I turned to check, the fire was exactly where it should be, but my shadow still pointed toward it. "Sarah," I called, but she was already climbing into the passenger seat, her face pale and determined. I finished the hookups in record time and jumped behind the wheel. The RV's engine turned over smoothly, and I felt a surge of relief as we pulled away from the campsite. In the side mirror, I could see the fire still burning in our abandoned stone circle, but at least it was getting smaller with distance. We'd driven maybe half a mile when Sarah grabbed my arm. "Stop." "What? Why?" "Just stop the RV." I pulled over, confused and irritated. We were on a narrow dirt road with forest pressing close on both sides, barely wide enough for our vehicle. "Sarah, what's—" "Look ahead." I looked. Through the windshield, maybe 100 yards down the road, I could see a glow between the trees. Orange light flickering against the pine trunks, exactly like— "That's not possible," I said. But it was. Somehow, impossibly, our campfire was burning ahead of us. Not a different fire, not some coincidental conflagration, but the same fire with the same stone circle and the same impossible flames. I could even see our camp chairs, still positioned where we'd moved them back from the heat. I put the RV in reverse and backed up slowly, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I reached what should have been our original campsite, it was empty. Just a bare patch of ground beside the river. No trace that we'd ever been there. "This isn't happening," Sarah whispered. "This can't be happening." I wanted to agree, but the evidence was right in front of us. Somehow the fire had moved. Or we had moved. Or the space between things had folded in a way that made geography meaningless. I tried turning around, but the road was too narrow and the trees too close. We'd have to drive forward, past the impossible fire, and hope that beyond it lay the main road and sanity. As we approached the campsite, our campsite that shouldn't exist here, I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead. But Sarah was staring out the passenger window and I heard her breath catch. "Marcus, there's someone by the fire." I couldn't help myself. I looked. A figure sat in one of our camp chairs, backlit by the flames so I couldn't make out features. Human-shaped but wrong, somehow, like a person-sized shadow that had learned to sit upright. As we drove past, it turned its head to watch us, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been a face, pale and featureless except for dark holes where eyes should be. Sarah made a small, wounded sound in her throat. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the RV's engine seemed sluggish, like we were driving through thick liquid instead of air. In the rearview mirror, I watched the figure stand up from the chair. It was tall, too tall, with arms that hung nearly to its knees. And then it started walking after us, moving with a strange, gliding gait that covered ground faster than should have been possible. "It's following us," I said, my voice cracking. Sarah turned in her seat to look back, then immediately whipped around to face forward. "Don't look at it. Whatever you do, don't look at it." But I couldn't help myself. The mirror drew my eyes like a magnet, and I watched the thing gain on us despite our speed. It moved like footage played in reverse, each step flowing backward into the next in a way that made my brain hurt. The road curved ahead, and for a moment I lost sight of our pursuer. When the curve straightened out, I expected to see it still following, but the road behind us was empty. Just darkness between the trees and the distant glow of the fire we'd somehow left behind again. "Is it gone?" Sarah asked without turning around. "I think so." But I was wrong. As we drove through the forest, I started noticing other fires. Small ones at first, tiny flames flickering deep in the woods, visible only as brief orange glints between tree trunks. Then larger ones, campfires burning in places where no camps could be, where the terrain was too steep or the undergrowth too thick for anyone to have built them. Each fire was tended by a figure. Some sat like the first one. Others stood or moved restlessly around their flames. All of them turned to watch us pass, and all of them had the same wrongness. Too tall, too pale, moving in ways that hurt to observe directly. "They're everywhere," Sarah whispered. "How are there so many of them?" I didn't have an answer. The forest that had seemed empty yesterday now felt crowded with impossible fires and their impossible tenders. Each flame cast light that reached further than it should, illuminating the watchers' pale forms against the dark trees. We drove for what felt like hours, but the dashboard clock insisted only 20 minutes had passed. The road should have brought us to the highway by now, but instead we seemed to be driving deeper into wilderness that grew stranger with each mile. The fires were getting bigger, and their tenders were getting bolder. Some stood right beside the road now, close enough that I could have reached out and touched them through the window. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were smooth and blank except for those dark eye holes that tracked our movement with hungry interest. "The fuel gauge," Sarah said suddenly. I looked down. The needle sat on empty, though I'd filled the tank yesterday afternoon. We should have had enough gas to reach San Francisco, but now the engine was starting to sputter. "We're going to run out," I said. "We can't stop. Not here. Not with them watching." But the RV made the decision for us. The engine coughed once, twice, and then died. Our momentum carried us a few more yards before we rolled to a stop in the middle of the dirt road, surrounded by forest full of impossible fires. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. Even the river had stopped its constant murmur. The only sound was our breathing and the faint crackling of flames from the dozens of fires visible through the trees. "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Before I could answer, she screamed. One of the figures was right outside her window, its pale face pressed against the glass. Up close, I could see that what I'd taken for smooth features were actually covered in symbols. The same geometric patterns that had appeared on our burning logs, carved or branded into translucent skin. The thing's mouth opened, revealing darkness deeper than the spaces where its eyes should be. It spoke in a voice like wind through dead leaves, forming words I didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Come to the fire," it said. "Come and burn." More figures emerged from the forest surrounding the RV, dozens of them, all speaking in unison now. "Come to the fire. Come and burn. Come to the fire. Come and burn." Sarah was hyperventilating, her hands pressed against her ears as if she could block out the voices. But I could feel them in my bones now, not just hearing, but feeling the words resonate through the RV's thin walls. "The radio," I said, reaching for the dashboard. Maybe we could call for help, reach someone who could explain what was happening. But when I turned on the RV's CB radio, the only thing that came through the speakers was more of the same. "Come to the fire. Come and burn." I tried different channels, different frequencies, but every station carried the same message spoken in the same inhuman voices. Even the static between stations seemed to whisper the words. The figures began moving closer, their pale hands pressed against the RV's windows and walls. The vehicle rocked slightly under their touch, and I could hear a sound like fingernails on glass as they scratched at the metal siding. "They can't get in," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Sarah. "We're safe inside." But even as I spoke, I could feel the RV's walls growing warm. Not from the engine, that had been dead for minutes, but from outside heat. The impossible fires were spreading, surrounding us, turning our refuge into an oven. Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the pale figures pressed against her window. "I want to go home," she whispered. "I just want to go home." I reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. Her fingers were ice cold despite the growing heat, and I could feel her trembling. "We're going to be okay," I lied. "We're going to figure this out." But I didn't believe it. The heat was intensifying, and I could smell smoke now. Not wood smoke, but something else. Something that reminded me of the scent that had come from our impossible campfire. One of the figures tapped on my window with a fingernail that was too long and too sharp. When I looked, it smiled with a mouth full of darkness and spoke directly to me. "Marcus, come to the fire, Marcus." Your fire is waiting." It knew my name. Somehow, this pale thing with symbols carved into its skin knew who I was. "How does it know my name?" I asked Sarah, but she was staring at her own window where another figure was speaking to her. "Sarah," it said in that wind-through-leaves voice. "Come and burn, Sarah. Join the fire, Sarah." The heat was becoming unbearable. Sweat poured down my face, and the RV's interior was starting to shimmer like a mirage. But worse than the heat was the growing certainty that the figures outside weren't just threatening us. They were calling us. Some part of me, some deep and traitorous part, was listening to their invitation and finding it appealing. The fire would be warm. The fire would be permanent. The fire would never go out, never disappoint, never leave me wondering what I'd done wrong, or how I could fix things that couldn't be fixed. "Marcus," Sarah said, and her voice sounded different, calmer. When I looked at her, she was smiling. Maybe they're right. Maybe we should go to the fire. No, the word came out harsher than I intended. "Sarah, that's not you talking. That's them, somehow. You have to fight it." But she was already reaching for the door handle. "It would be easier," she said dreamily. "No more therapy, no more fighting, no more trying to save something that's already broken." I lunged across the RV and grabbed her wrist. "Sarah, listen to me. That's not what you want. You're stronger than this." For a moment, her eyes cleared and she looked at me with recognition. "Marcus, what's happening to us?" "I don't know, but we're going to fight it. Whatever they're doing to our heads, we're going to fight it." The figures outside began chanting louder, their voices rising to a crescendo that made the RV's windows vibrate. "Come to the fire. Come and burn. Come to the fire. Come and burn." The sound was overwhelming, invasive, working its way into my thoughts like a worm. Part of me wondered why I was resisting. The fire would be so much simpler than this complicated, painful existence, so much easier than trying to save a marriage that might already be dead. But looking at Sarah, really looking at her, seeing the fear beneath the supernatural calm, I remembered why I'd brought her here. Not to fix our relationship, but to find whatever was still worth saving. And if that wasn't much, if we were truly broken beyond repair, then at least we could face that truth as ourselves, not as fuel for something else's hunger. "The emergency kit," I said. "Under your seat. There's flares in there." Sarah blinked, processing my words through the fog of whatever influence the figures were exerting. "Flares?" "Iron," I said, remembering half-forgotten folklore. "Iron and fire. Maybe that's why they want our fire so badly, because they can't make their own." It was a desperate guess, but desperation was all we had left. Sarah fumbled under her seat and pulled out the emergency kit, her movements slow and uncertain. Inside were road flares, a first aid kit, and a small fire extinguisher. I grabbed a flare and struck it. The sudden burst of red light filled the RV, and the chanting outside immediately changed pitch, becoming shrieking instead of words. Through the windows I could see the pale figures recoiling from the chemical flame. "It's working," Sarah said, and her voice sounded more like herself. I cracked the window and shoved the flare outside. The nearest figure stumbled backward, its pale skin smoking where the red light touched it. The symbols carved into its flesh began glowing like brands, and it screamed in a voice that sounded like tearing metal. "More," I said. "Light them all." We lit every flare in the kit, pushing them through windows and vents until the RV was surrounded by harsh red light. The figures retreated, but they didn't disappear. They stood at the edge of the flare light, watching and waiting with infinite patience. "The flares won't last forever," Sarah said. She was right. Already the first one was beginning to sputter and fade. When it died, the figures would return. And then, "The fuel," I said suddenly. "They took our fuel somehow, drained it to trap us here. But the engine's dead. The generator, it runs on propane. The RV's generator was designed to power the electrical systems when we weren't hooked up to campground power. But it also had wheels, and if I could get it running..." I climbed into the back of the RV and found the generator manual. The instructions were simple enough. Prime the fuel line, check the oil, pull the starter cord. But my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the book. Outside, the figures were testing the boundaries of our flare light, creeping closer as each flame weakened. One of them called my name again, its voice patient and seductive. "Marcus, why do you struggle? The fire will take away all pain." I ignored it and focused on the generator. "Prime the fuel line, check the oil, pull the cord." Nothing. "Pull again." Nothing. "Marcus," Sarah said urgently, "the flares are almost out." "Pull again." Again. The generator coughed, almost caught, died. The first flare guttered out, and immediately a pale hand pressed against the window where it had been. More hands followed as other flares failed until the figures were pressed against the RV from all sides. "Come to the fire," they chanted. "Come and burn." I pulled the starter cord with everything I had, pouring all my fear and desperation into the motion. The generator roared to life, and every light in the RV blazed on at once. The figures screamed and stumbled backward, their pale forms smoking in the electric light. But this time, they didn't just retreat. They began to fade, becoming translucent, then invisible. "The headlights," I said, rushing to the driver's seat. "If the generator's running, maybe." I turned the key. The engine was still dead, but the electrical systems came online. The headlights blazed through the windshield, cutting a path through the darkness ahead. "Drive," Sarah said. "Even if the engine's dead, maybe we can coast." It was insane, but so was everything else that had happened. I put the RV in neutral and released the parking brake. Gravity and the slight downward slope of the road started us rolling forward. We picked up speed slowly, the headlights carving through darkness that seemed thicker than normal night. Behind us, I could hear the figures regrouping, their chanting resuming as they realized we were escaping. "Faster," Sarah urged, but there was nothing I could do except steer and hope the slope continued. The speedometer crept up. 5 miles per hour. 10. 15. Not fast enough to outrun pursuit, but maybe fast enough to reach whatever lay ahead. The road curved, and suddenly I could see lights through the trees. Real lights, electric streetlights and the glow of buildings. Civilization. "There," I said, pointing. "The highway." We coasted down the final hill and rolled to a stop at the intersection with Highway 180. Normal traffic flowed past us, late-night truckers and early-morning commuters who had no idea what we'd just escaped. I sat behind the wheel, shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline finally hit me. Sarah was crying again, but these were tears of relief, not terror. "What were those things?" she asked. "I don't know. I don't think I want to know." A California Highway Patrol cruiser pulled up behind us, its red and blue lights flashing. The officer who approached our window was young and professional, showing no sign that anything unusual had happened. "Engine trouble?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. "Can you call a tow truck?" "Of course. You folks okay? You look pretty shaken up." I almost laughed. Shaken up didn't begin to cover it. "We had a rough night camping." The officer nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, these mountain roads can be tricky in the dark. You're lucky you didn't slide off into a ditch." He called for a tow truck and waited with us until it arrived. The whole time I kept glancing back toward the forest road we'd escaped from, expecting to see pale figures watching from the trees. But there was nothing, just normal darkness under normal stars. The tow truck driver got our engine started with a simple procedure that should have worked hours ago. "Vapor lock," he explained. "Happens sometimes with altitude changes. Fuel pump can't get proper suction." A rational explanation. A normal mechanical problem with a normal solution. I wanted to believe it, but I could still smell smoke on our clothes. Not wood smoke, but something else. Something that shouldn't exist. We drove home in silence, neither of us wanting to discuss what had happened. How could we? Who would believe us? Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The marriage counselor noticed a change in our next session. "You seem different," she said. "More connected somehow." She was right. Surviving something impossible together had created a bond between Sarah and me that all our previous efforts couldn't achieve. We stopped fighting about small things, stopped picking at old wounds. When you face the literal impossible, everyday problems lose their power to destroy you. But we also stopped camping. Any mention of spending time in the wilderness made both of us uncomfortable. We sold the RV 3 weeks later, taking a substantial loss that neither of us cared about. Sometimes, late at night, I'll catch Sarah staring out our bedroom window at the small fire pit in our backyard. She never lights it anymore, and neither do I. Fire feels different now. Not warm and comforting, but hungry. Always hungry. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is still, I swear I can hear them calling from whatever space they inhabit. Come to the fire. Come and burn. I know that someday one of us will listen. Maybe both of us. There's a part of me that never really left those woods. A part that still sits by an impossible fire and burns without being consumed. That part grows stronger every day, fed by the memory of how simple it would have been to just open the door and walk into the flames. But not today. Today, Sarah and I are still ourselves, still fighting to save something that might be worth saving after all. Today, we choose the difficult path of remaining human. Tomorrow, well, tomorrow the fire will still be waiting.